Some wars are fought with artillery shells weighing more than 20 pounds and tanks plated with steel several inches thick. Others are fought quietly, inside offices where typewriters clatter late into the night and dossiers stack higher than a man's arm. In Germany during the 1930s, a different kind of machine began operating. One that did not burn hundreds of tons of gasoline or fire cannons across battlefields. Instead, it gathered names, addresses, accusations, and whispers. That machine became known as the Gestapo. The organization emerged in 1933 during the chaotic months when the Nazi regime consolidated power. At first, the structure looked deceptively small. A few offices in Berlin filled with clerks, investigators, and officers reviewing stacks of reports. Those papers contained information collected from informants, police records, intercepted letters, and sometimes anonymous accusations. Within a short time, the number of files expanded into the tens of thousands, each one containing details about individuals suspected of opposing the regime. Inside those early offices, the atmosphere often resembled a bureaucratic workshop rather than a battlefield. A single file folder might weigh only a few ounces, yet inside it lay interrogation transcripts, surveillance notes, and arrest orders that could determine a person's fate. Typewriters hammered out documents describing surveillance operations carried out across cities where millions of people lived under increasing scrutiny. The reach of the Gestapo expanded quickly because it operated alongside an entire state apparatus. Local police departments, party officials, and civilian informants supplied information constantly. Letters intercepted by censors added new names to watch lists. Conversations overheard in factories or cafes sometimes ended up summarized in reports typed on thin sheets of paper. Imagine a Gestapo office late in the evening somewhere in Berlin. A desk lamp throws yellow light across stacks of documents, while an officer reads through statements written earlier that day. The room smells faintly of ink and paper. Outside the building, the city continues moving. Streetcars clatter along tracks. Footsteps echo along sidewalks. Yet inside those walls, decisions are being written that will ripple through hundreds of lives. What made the Gestapo particularly powerful was not its size alone, but the legal authority it acquired. Arrests could occur without conventional judicial review. A person could disappear into detention based on suspicion alone. The paperwork documenting those decisions often filled multiple pages, yet the act itself could take only minutes. A knock at a door, a brief conversation, then a departure under guard. I remember studying surviving Gestapo files preserved in archives years later. The documents are often methodical, written in stiff administrative language. One page might list an arrest order. Another contains an interrogation transcript typed with careful precision. Yet, when you read through dozens of those files in sequence, the cumulative effect becomes unsettling. Thousands of individual cases assemble into a system that monitored entire communities. During the late 1930s and throughout the war years, the Gestapo's operations stretched across territories occupied by Germany. Branch offices appeared in major cities across Europe. Intelligence gathered through interrogations and surveillance fed into wider networks run by the security services of the regime. Numbers reveal part of the scale. Tens of thousands of individuals passed through Gestapo investigations. Interrogation rooms processed detainees whose cases ranged from political opposition to suspected resistance activities. The documentation surrounding each case, arrest forms, interrogation notes, transfer orders, sometimes filled folders several inches thick. Inside an interrogation room, the environment could feel stark. A table, 2 chairs, perhaps a single overhead lamp. A file placed on the table containing statements collected earlier. The officer conducting the questioning already knows many details about the person sitting across from him, because reports from informants and surveillance units have accumulated over weeks or months. The Gestapo also cooperated with other organizations within the Nazi security structure. Information flowed between intelligence services, SS units, and local police networks. This web of coordination allowed investigations to spread across regions quickly when resistance activity surfaced. Yet the system depended heavily on information provided by civilians. Denunciations from neighbors, co-workers, or acquaintances often initiated investigations. Sometimes these accusations involved genuine political opposition. Other times they grew from personal disputes, jealousy, or fear. Regardless of origin, once written into official reports, those accusations entered the machinery of the state. When I read testimonies recorded after the war from people who lived under that surveillance environment, many describe a subtle shift in everyday life. Conversations in public became shorter. Letters were written carefully. Even private discussions among friends sometimes paused when unfamiliar listeners appeared nearby. By the later years of the war, the Gestapo faced a different environment. Resistance movements in occupied territories increased their activities. Intelligence officers attempted to identify underground networks operating in cities where bomb damage and military setbacks already strained the regime. Files multiplied further. Arrest lists lengthened. Interrogations continued even as the military situation for Germany deteriorated. Picture an office in a German city during the final months of the war. Bomb damage surrounds the building. Windows are patched with boards. Yet inside the office, the same routine continues. Documents typed, reports filed, arrests recorded. The system that once expanded with confidence now operated under the pressure of a collapsing state. As Allied armies advanced across Europe, Gestapo offices hurriedly destroyed files to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Yet many records survived, later becoming key evidence during post-war investigations. When historians study those documents today, they provide an unusually detailed picture of how surveillance and repression functioned within the regime. Page after page reveals the bureaucratic mechanics behind a system designed to control society through fear, information, and enforcement. Sometimes I pause when reading those archival pages and imagine the moment each report was written, the sound of the typewriter keys, the officer signing his name at the bottom of the document. At that moment, the writer probably viewed it as another routine administrative task. Yet decades later, those pages still speak. And if you are listening now while the room grows quiet and your thoughts begin drifting towards sleep, imagine those old files resting in archives today. Paper yellowed with age, ink fading slightly, each one carrying fragments of stories from a time when surveillance reached into the private corners of everyday life. This is the entire history of the Gestapo, Hitler's secret police state. Chapter 1. The Corpse of the Weimar Police. The 30th of January, 1933, Berlin, a Tuesday. Somewhere inside the Reich Chancellery, the paperwork for a new government is being processed with the methodical precision that German bureaucracy had always brought to such moments. In the offices of the Prussian Interior Ministry, a few blocks away, men in civilian suits are still at their desks, filing, stamping, cross-referencing case numbers against names. They have done this every working day for years. Nothing, at least on paper, has changed. The ventilation in the lower filing rooms hums at its usual pitch. The smell of carbon paper and ink sits in the air the same way it did yesterday, the same way it did under the previous government and the one before that. What strikes me most when I sit with the administrative records from this period is how utterly ordinary the machinery of transition looks. There's no moment of rupture in the filing logs, no torn page, no sudden absence of entries. The Prussian Political Police, Abteilung 1A, as it was formally designated, kept recording cases on the 31st of January and the 1st of February and every working day afterward, as though the name above the door hadn't changed at all. That continuity is not incidental. It is the story. Because what Hermann Göring understood, within weeks of being appointed Prussian Minister of the Interior, was something that no amount of SA marching or torchlit processions could provide. He didn't need to build a secret police force from nothing. One already existed. It just needed new management. The Prussian political police had spent the preceding decade doing what Republican governments do with their intelligence services, compiling files. Names, addresses, known associates, political affiliations, attendance at meetings. They had done this legally, under Weimar-era statute, targeting communists, social democrats, far-right agitators, and anyone else deemed a threat to public order. By the time Goering arrived, Abteilung Ia held records on approximately 47,000 named individuals, accumulated through entirely legitimate police procedure over the course of the Republic's short life. This was not a surveillance state's product. This was a democracy's routine intelligence work. And in January of 1933, it became something else entirely. The files didn't change. The purpose they served did. To run his new political police, Goering recruited a man named Rudolf Diels. This is where the history gets complicated in ways that most accounts don't fully acknowledge. Diels was not a committed National Socialist. He had actually spent part of his earlier career investigating early Nazi activities on behalf of the Weimar government. He was a careerist, highly intelligent, politically flexible, and crucially, he knew where every single file in Abteilung 1A was kept. Goering didn't choose Diels because of his ideology. He chose him because of his institutional knowledge. The man who had cataloged the threats to one republic became the man tasked with eliminating the perceived enemies of its successor. It's the kind of quiet irony that gets lost in the bigger narratives about torchlight and fanaticism. But to me, it tells you more about how authoritarian systems actually function than any number of mass rallies. On the 26th of April, 1933, Goering signed the founding decree that formally established the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police office. The building selected for its headquarters was at Prinz Albrechtstrasse 8 in central Berlin. Until very recently, it had been the Prussian School of Arts and Crafts. The furniture from the school was still being moved out when the Gestapo moved in. The official name, abbreviated to Gestapo in the shorthand of internal memos, was almost an accident of bureaucratic convenience. What mattered was the function, and the function was already encoded in the 47,000 file cards that came with the job. The founding decree itself, reproduced in the Nuremberg prosecution document collection, is worth reading with some care, because what it doesn't say is as important as what it does. It doesn't describe a new organization with novel powers. It describes a reorganization of existing police functions under new administrative authority. The language is administrative, moderate, even dull. This was deliberate. What made the Gestapo genuinely novel wasn't the decree that created it. It was a subsequent legal instrument, issued several weeks later, that quietly removed the requirement for Gestapo detention orders to be reviewed by any court. That single change, the elimination of judicial oversight for what was called Schutzhaft, or protective custody, transformed a bureaucratic reorganization into something without precedent in modern German governance. You could now be arrested and held indefinitely on the Gestapo's authority alone, with no judge, no charge, no timeline. The Schutzhaft mechanism deserves a moment of technical attention, because it's one of those procedural details that sounds dry until you understand its consequences. Under the Weimar Constitution's emergency powers framework, temporary detention without charge had been legally possible, but it required judicial confirmation within 24 hours. The Reichstag fire decree of the 28th of February 1933 suspended that confirmation requirement. It was presented as an emergency measure. Emergency measures in 1933 Germany had a way of becoming permanent. What Diels then did, with a bureaucrat's instinctive efficiency, was to create pre-signed blank Schutzhaft order forms that regional commanders could fill in as needed. The ministerial check that had once provided at least a theoretical break on unlimited detention was now a printed line on a form that someone else had already signed. He called it administrative streamlining. It was the first automated architecture of unlimited arrest. I want to be precise about something here because I think it matters for how we understand everything that follows. The Gestapo in these first months was not yet the organization it would become. It was understaffed, organizationally chaotic, operating out of a building that still smelled faintly of art school, and run by a man who wasn't even a party member when he took the job. Diels himself, according to his post-war memoir, spent a significant portion of his early tenure trying to impose some degree of bureaucratic order on the improvised violence that the SA had been conducting in makeshift detention facilities across Berlin. He wasn't doing this out of compassion. The post-war testimony of survivors makes it clear that the Hausgefängnis beneath Prinz Albrechtstrasse 8 was not a humane place. He was doing it because visible, uncontrolled brutality created documentary liability. And Diels was the kind of administrator who understood that institutions that can't manage their own records eventually lose control of themselves. By the summer of 1933, the Prussian Gestapo had processed somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of Schutzhaft cases. Diels' own post-war figure to Allied investigators, almost certainly an undercount. These were not all communists or active resistance figures. They were journalists, lawyers, trade union officials, civil servants who had served under the previous government, and anyone whose name appeared in those inherited Abteilung IA files in a category that the new administration found inconvenient. The 47,000 cards that had been assembled under the rule of law were now a targeting list. The archive of a democracy had become the operational database of its replacement. And yet, at the end of 1933, the Gestapo was still only a Prussian institution. It had no authority over Bavaria, where Himmler controlled the political police, no authority over Saxony or Württemberg or any of the other German states. It was a formidable regional apparatus, but it was not yet the national instrument that history remembers. That transformation was coming, but it would require a different kind of man to complete it. And Diels, for all his administrative intelligence, was not that man. He had already been identified as a liability by forces that were positioning themselves above him, and the question mark he had penciled in the margin of his own transfer order was about to be answered. Chapter 2. Diels, the man who knew too much. The spring of 1934, Berlin, and the city is watching itself carefully. In the corridors of Gestapo headquarters at Prinz Albrechtstrasse 8, Rudolf Diels is still technically in command, but the walls of his office have developed a way of listening that he didn't authorize. The inter-office memos are taking slightly longer to arrive at his desk than they used to. Certain telephone calls are being routed around him. The organization he built from inherited parts is being rebuilt around him, slowly, with the patience of someone who understands that institutions are won not by frontal assault, but by gradual infiltration. Diels knows this because he is, himself, very good at it, and that is precisely why he knows what's happening. Rudolf Diels published his memoirs in 1949 under the title Lucifer ante portas, Lucifer before the gates. I've read it carefully, and I want to be honest about what kind of document it is. It is not a confession. It is a defense brief dressed in literary clothing. Diels presents himself throughout as a moderating influence, a man who saved lives, who resisted the worst excesses, who was ultimately removed precisely because he was too decent for the job. The archival record offers a considerably more complicated picture. Post-war investigations confirmed, at most, 3 specific instances where Diels personally intervened to prevent extrajudicial violence against prisoners, and one of the individuals he claimed to have saved was rearrested and killed in 1936. Diels survived, wrote his memoirs, died in a car accident in Lower Saxony in 1957, and left behind a document that is, simultaneously, almost certainly wrong in its self-portrait, and often reliable in its account of specific events. Separating the two is the ongoing task of anyone working seriously with this source. What the memoir does capture accurately, and this is why it remains valuable, is the texture of the internal power struggle that was consuming the Gestapo in 1933 and 1934. Himmler, who had been consolidating control of state political police forces one German state at a time since March of 1933, needed Prussia. Prussia was the largest German state. Its political police was the most powerful, and the man standing between Himmler and that prize was Diels, protected for the moment by Goering, who valued him as a personal asset and understood that losing control of the Prussian Gestapo would mean losing a significant instrument of his own political power. The result was a triangular conflict between Goering, Himmler, and Diels that played out in intercepted memos, selectively routed intelligence reports, and what can only be described as institutional subterfuge conducted at a very high professional level. Himmler's method was characteristic. He used Heydrich. By early 1934, the SD, Himmler's internal SS intelligence service, was circulating reports suggesting that Diels had communist sympathies. The evidence was, by any fair assessment, manufactured or heavily embellished. But the purpose wasn't to prove a legal case against Diels. The purpose was to make Göring uncomfortable about his protégé, to introduce doubt, to make the calculation of protecting Diels more costly than releasing him. This is documented in surviving SS internal correspondence, and it reflects something important about how the organizations competing for power within the early Nazi state actually operated. Raw violence was one instrument. The manipulation of institutional information, using the machinery of surveillance against people inside the system, was another, arguably more sophisticated one. The specific figure at the center of Diels' institutional downfall was Reinhard Heydrich. In 1934, Heydrich had already been building the SD's intelligence networks for 3 years, constructing what would eventually become a shadow intelligence apparatus running parallel to and competing with every other security institution in Germany. He was 30 years old. He had been dismissed from the German Navy 3 years earlier following an honor tribunal over a broken engagement. The specific circumstances are documented in naval records, and had subsequently attached himself to Himmler with the focused ambition of a man who had decided that the SS offered something the Navy couldn't, a vertical hierarchy with genuinely unlimited room at the top. Heydrich understood Diels not as a political opponent, but as an obstacle to be bypassed by administrative means, and he approached the task with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. On the 20th of April 1934, Hitler's birthday, which lends the timing a certain bureaucratic irony, Göring formally transferred control of the Prussian Gestapo to Himmler. The transfer was framed as a coordination measure, a rationalization of parallel police structures. Diels was given the face-saving title of Regierungspräsident, regional governor, of Cologne, removed from the organization he had built at exactly the moment of its greatest institutional significance. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't prosecuted. He was simply repositioned with the elegant brutality of a chess player removing a piece that has become tactically inconvenient. To me, this is the most revealing moment of his entire story. Not the founding of the Gestapo, not his claimed acts of mercy, but this. He was too useful to destroy and too much of a liability to retain. The system knew what to do with him. What replaced Diels was not a single individual, but a structural shift. With Himmler as head of the Prussian Gestapo and Heydrich as his operational deputy, the organization entered a qualitatively different phase. Where Diels had been a Weimar-era civil servant adapting to new masters, Himmler and Heydrich were ideological architects, men who had a specific theory of what a secret police force was for and how it should function. Diels had run the Gestapo as an intelligence and arrest operation, essentially a more powerful version of what Abteilung 1 had always been. Himmler and Heydrich intended to run it as the enforcement mechanism of a new racial order, and that required structural changes that went well beyond a personnel transfer at the top. The specific bureaucratic machinery that Diels left behind deserves attention here. Between the founding decree of April 1933 and his removal in April 1934, Diels had taken a regional political police unit and begun building it into something with genuinely national operational ambitions. The pre-signed Schutzhaft order forms, the reorganization of the filing system into categories of threat, the establishment of formal liaison procedures with the SA and SS, these were Diels' institutional contributions. They weren't ideologically motivated in any deep sense. They were administrative innovations by a man trying to run a complex organization efficiently. And because they were efficient, they survived him completely. The next management team walked into a functioning machine. They didn't have to build the track. They just had to decide where the train was going. Diels would appear again in this story, at Nuremberg in 1945 and 46, this time as a prosecution witness rather than a defendant. His testimony there is available in the trial record, and it's worth noting that he did provide useful evidence, specific operational details about the early Gestapo that Allied prosecutors used in building their case. Whether this constitutes redemption or a final act of bureaucratic self-preservation is a judgment call that the historical record won't make for you. What I find genuinely fascinating about Diels, sitting with his file at this distance, is how perfectly he embodies a category that recurs throughout the history of authoritarian institutions. The competent, morally flexible civil servant who makes the machinery run, maintains plausible distance from the worst of what the machinery does, and survives. He is not the villain of this story. He's something more troubling. He is the infrastructure. By the summer of 1934, with Himmler and Heydrich in place, the Gestapo had a new character. It was still understaffed by any reasonable assessment, covering Prussia's population of roughly 40 million people with a few thousand officers. It still relied heavily on the inherited Weimar-era files, but its leadership now had a coherent ideology, an institutional theory, and an aggressive appetite for expansion beyond Prussia's borders. The other German states still had their own independent political police forces. That situation was about to change, state by state, month by month, through the same combination of political pressure and bureaucratic maneuver that had removed Diels. And the man managing that campaign, methodical, cold, and 30 years old, was only just getting started. Chapter 3. Himmler's Acquisition. The police state unified. There's a document in the German Federal Archive that I think gets less attention than it deserves. It is the decree of the 17th of June, 1936, signed by the Reich Interior Minister, and it runs to 4 paragraphs. Most of those paragraphs are entirely administrative, the kind of text that civil servants write to formalize things that have already effectively happened. The 3rd paragraph, however, contains a marginal insertion written in different ink from the rest of the text. The insertion adds the phrase, "without being bound by the regulations applicable to other civil servants." Someone added those words at the last moment, in a different pen, and they were allowed to stand. That insertion is the legal birth date of a police force that answered to nothing and no one except the men who ran it. You can build a very long argument about the nature of totalitarianism from that single handwritten clause. The story of how Heinrich Himmler consolidated control of every German state's political police between 1933 and 1936 is, at its core, a story about the systematic exploitation of Germany's federal structure. Germany in 1933 was not a unitary state. It was a federation of individual states, Bavaria, Prussia, Saxony, Württemberg, and the others, each with its own interior ministry, its own police, and its own political police apparatus. The Nazis had won a national election, but they had not, at the moment of Hitler's appointment as chancellor, won legal control of every state government. Himmler moved to remedy this with a campaign that combined direct political pressure, SS infiltration of state police leaderships, and the patient accumulation of emergency powers that the chaos of the early Nazi period made available. Bavaria fell first, in March of 1933, where Himmler had the advantage of operating on home territory. The smaller states followed through combinations of coordination agreements and outright political coercion. By April of 1934, with Göring's handover of Prussia, Himmler held all of them. What he did with that control is the technical story of this chapter, and it requires some patience with institutional detail, because the details matter. Himmler's instrument was the Sicherheitspolizei, the security police, which combined the Gestapo with the Kriminalpolizei, the criminal investigation department, under a unified command structure. This was administratively elegant because it meant that the same organizational hierarchy that managed political surveillance also managed criminal investigations, blurring the institutional line between political persecution and criminal law enforcement in a way that proved extremely difficult to challenge legally. A man arrested by the Gestapo could, for administrative purposes, be processed through the criminal police filing system, and vice versa. The paper trail became a maze, and the maze was the point. The Gestapo Law of 1936 is the document that formalizes all of this into something approaching a constitutional arrangement, if the word constitutional can be applied without irony to a legal framework designed to eliminate legal oversight. The law explicitly exempted Gestapo operations from review by administrative courts. This was not an oversight or an ambiguity. The Supreme Administrative Court of Prussia had, on two separate occasions prior to the law's passage, attempted to review Gestapo detention orders and had been stymied by procedural resistance from the Gestapo's legal office. The 1936 law was written specifically to prevent any future attempt of this kind. Werner Best, the Gestapo's chief legal officer and a trained jurist who had developed a coherent, if monstrous, theoretical framework for the racial state's relationship to law, wrote substantial sections of this legislation. Best believed, and argued in internal SS publications, that in a racially defined state, the security police was not subject to ordinary law because it was the expression of the people's biological will. This wasn't legal improvisation. It was a considered legal theory, carefully articulated, and it produced a law that the Reich courts accepted without significant challenge. At the moment of the 1936 Unification, the Gestapo employed approximately 7,000 full-time officers across the whole of Germany, a nation of roughly 66 million people. 7,000. I keep returning to that number because it becomes the key to understanding everything that follows. 7,000 officers covering 66 million people cannot operate a functioning surveillance state through direct observation alone. The mathematics simply don't work. Something else must be supplying the operational capacity. The answer to what that something else was is the subject of a later chapter, but it's worth planting the number here and holding it. One Gestapo officer per approximately 9,400 German citizens. The implications of that ratio are not what you might expect. The structural changes of 1936 also included the formalization of the Gestapo's internal departmental organization. Department 1 handled personnel and administration. Department 2 dealt with opponents, political investigation, the core function. Department 3 managed counterintelligence, monitoring German citizens' contacts with foreign powers. Department 4 handled records and press. This organizational skeleton is important because it was the framework that Heydrich would later use as the armature for the far larger RSHA structure, and because it reveals something about institutional priorities. The largest and most heavily staffed department was always Department 2, investigation of internal opponents. The rest of the organization existed to support that function. The new title Himmler assumed on the 17th of June, 1936, Reichsführer SS and Chief of German Police, is deceptively modest-sounding. It meant that the man who commanded the SS, which was at this point an ideological and military organization with its own paramilitary formations, now also directly commanded the entire national police apparatus. These two things, the party's private army and the state's law enforcement, were now in the same hands. The hyphen in the title was, as I've noted in my own research notes, probably the most consequential piece of punctuation in the administrative history of the Third Reich. Before that hyphen, it was theoretically possible for the state's police function to be separated from the party's ideological enforcement apparatus. After it, that separation ceased to exist even as a theoretical possibility. There is something almost poignant about the Justice Ministry's response to all of this. Several senior figures within the Reich Ministry of Justice filed internal protests against the 1936 Gestapo law's exemption from judicial review. These were not men resisting Nazism. They were loyal to the regime. But they believed, or at least argued, that a state presenting itself as a legitimate government needed to maintain the appearance of judicial process, even if the substance had been gutted. Their protests were filed, noted in the administrative record, and ignored with complete finality. The protests exist in the archive. I found them while cross-referencing the legislative drafts with the ministerial correspondence files. And what struck me wasn't the protest itself, but the care with which it was stamped, logged, and shelved. The bureaucracy processed its own dissent with the same efficiency it processed everything else. By the end of 1936, the Gestapo had achieved something that would have been legally unthinkable in any functioning constitutional state: total insulation from any independent oversight, combined with operational authority over the entire German population and a filing system containing millions of individual case records. The organization still had genuine operational limitations. The staffing levels remained thin, the intelligence was uneven in quality, and the card index system, while formidable, was also a paper mechanism subject to all the inefficiencies that paper creates. These limitations mattered. They help explain why the organization functioned the way it did, rather than the way it's usually imagined. But the structural transformation of 1936 removed the last institutional break. What happened next was not the product of any single decision or decree. It was the product of an apparatus finally freed from any constraint except the ideology of the men who ran it. The decree of the 17th of June, 1936, sits in the archive with all the other administrative documents of the period. The same off-white paper, the same official stamps, the same filing code. Nothing about its physical appearance announces its significance. That, in a way, is the final point. The most consequential legal change in the history of the German police state looked, on the desk, exactly like a routine administrative reorganization, which, in formal terms, it was. The handwritten insertion in the margin is the only physical sign that someone, at the last moment, understood exactly what they were doing, and did it anyway. Chapter 4. The Card Index of Fear, inside the Gestapo's filing system. The 2nd of November, 1937. A Tuesday afternoon in the regional Gestapo office in Düsseldorf. The building is unremarkable. A converted administrative space with high ceilings and linoleum floors that squeak in cold weather. In the filing room on the second floor, a clerk, almost certainly a civilian administrative employee, since much of this work was done by women in non-uniformed roles, is updating a case record. The card is 10 centimeters by 15 centimeters, standard issue, pre-printed with designated fields. The field at the top reads Verdächtig, suspect. Below it, typed entries: a name, an address in a residential neighborhood, an occupation, and then a single word under the category field. The clerk updates the file with 2 new pieces of information, adds a date stamp, returns the card to its place in the drawer. The drawer slides shut with a quiet, mechanical click. When Frank McDonough conducted his research into the surviving Gestapo records from the Düsseldorf region, 73,000 individual case files that, by some combination of administrative oversight and the chaos of 1945, survived the general destruction of Gestapo documentation, he was working with what is genuinely one of the most significant surviving primary source archives for understanding how the organization functioned at the operational level. The Düsseldorf files are important not because they're exceptional, but because they're representative. They show, in granular detail, how a Gestapo regional office actually worked. Not the policy decisions made in Berlin, not the ideology of the leadership, but the daily administrative mechanics of maintaining surveillance over a large civilian population. And what they show is, in several ways, deeply counterintuitive. The first counterintuitive finding is the sheer scope of the coverage. The Düsseldorf region had a population of roughly 400,000 people in the late 1930s. The 73,000 surviving files represent approximately 1 file for every 5.5 residents. That's not uniform coverage. Some categories of people were dramatically overrepresented, some barely present at all. But it represents a density of administrative attention that is difficult to conceptualize in human terms. Each of those 73,000 files represents a named individual whose life had been touched, in some form, by the machinery of the security state. A record created, a notation made, a stamp applied. Many of these files record nothing more than a report received, investigated, and closed without further action. But the file was opened. The card was made. The person was, in bureaucratic terms, inside the system. The structure of the filing system itself is worth understanding in some technical detail, because the system's design reveals the organization's underlying theory of social control. Each card was pre-printed with designated fields: name, address, occupation, category of potential offense, source of the report, cross-references to related files, and a field called Besondere Merkmale, special characteristics. The categories of offense were not improvised case by case. They were standardized: communist or Marxist activities, social democratic activities, Jewish racial offenses, homosexuality, Jehovah's Witness activity, asocial behavior, work-shy conduct, foreign national violations, and a catch-all category for political unreliability. Each category had its own administrative handling protocol: different departments, different recommended responses, different escalation paths. The filing system was not a passive record of investigations. It was an active classification system that determined, by category assignment, what happened to you next. What I find particularly revealing, and this is something I keep returning to in my own engagement with the scholarship on this material, is the source of report field, because a significant proportion of these files were not opened by Gestapo officers acting on their own initiative. They were opened in response to reports from outside the organization. Robert Gelatali's analysis of the Würzburg Gestapo files, conducted in the 1980s, found that roughly 54% of cases in that region were initiated by civilian denunciations rather than by active Gestapo surveillance. The Düsseldorf files, examined by McDonough, show a similar pattern. The implications of this are substantial, and the full argument will be made in a later chapter. For now, the technical point is that the filing system was architecturally designed to receive external reports: the intake form, the processing protocol, the category assignment. All of this presupposed that a significant portion of the system's input would come from outside the organization itself. The infrastructure of surveillance was built to process voluntary civilian participation. The specific mechanics of how a denunciation became a case file are worth tracing, because the procedure reveals both the system's efficiency and its dangers. A citizen arriving at a Gestapo office to make a report was met by a receiving officer who completed a standardized intake form. This form had a field for relationship to accused, a field that existed, according to internal Gestapo guidelines, because officers were trained to weight reports differently based on who was making them. A report from a stranger carried more initial evidentiary weight than a report from a close family member, precisely because the guidelines acknowledged, internally, not publicly, that personal enmity could motivate reports. An officer who noted, "appears motivated by personal enmity" in the intake file was following procedure. And then, in most documented cases, they filed the report anyway. The acknowledgement of the abuse didn't prevent it, it just created a notation. The system also tracked the accusers. This is perhaps the detail that surprised me most when I worked through the scholarship on this. The same filing infrastructure that recorded the accused also noted, in cross-referenced files, the identities of those who had reported them. This created an extraordinary secondary database, a map of who in German society was willing to use the Gestapo as an instrument of denunciation, which was itself a form of intelligence. It meant that a citizen who denounced a neighbor was also, by that act, generating their own entry in the system. The surveillance apparatus recorded its own sources. The informants were inside the card index alongside the people they had reported. By 1938, the Central Gestapo maintained a master card index, the Zentralkartei in Berlin, that contained records on an estimated 4 million individuals across the Reich. 4 million, in a German population of 79 million. This was not a list of active threats or confirmed criminals. It was a list of people who had come to the organization's attention for any reason, at any time, in any capacity. Some of those 4 million had files because they had attended a political meeting in 1929. Some because a neighbor had made a report that was investigated and dismissed. Some because they appeared in the cross-references of someone else's file. The Zentralkartei was, by its nature, over-inclusive. It was designed to be. Information was cheap to retain and potentially valuable to retrieve, and in a system without judicial oversight, there was no institutional pressure to purge files that had proven groundless. The practical consequence of all this administrative infrastructure is what matters most. When, in November of 1938, the Gestapo received an operational order to arrest between 25,000 and 30,000 Jewish men within 48 hours. The operation was logistically feasible only because those men were already in the filing system. The addresses were known. The addresses were verified. The cards were in the drawers, alphabetized and cross-referenced. The operation, which we'll examine in detail in a later chapter, wasn't built in November of 1938. It was built over the preceding 5 years, one card at a time, one entry at a time, by clerks in filing rooms with squeaking linoleum floors who were doing their jobs with professional care. I want to make one further point about the Düsseldorf archive that sits uncomfortably in the scholarship and deserves to be named. Post-war analysis has established that a significant portion of the files relating to Jewish residents were methodically removed and destroyed before the Allied advance in 1944 and 45. The destruction was targeted. The 73,000 files that survive are therefore not a representative sample of the full system. They are, in a specific sense, the files that the Gestapo judged least incriminating to leave behind. The archive we have is the archive they chose not to destroy. The files on Jewish victims, files that would have provided the most direct documentary evidence of the persecution machinery's operation, were disproportionately removed. What remains, while invaluable, is the remainder after a deliberate act of evidence destruction. Every conclusion we draw from the surviving material must be held against that fact. The drawer slides shut. The clerk moves to the next card. Somewhere in the Zentralkartei in Berlin, a cross-reference is being updated. 4 million names, and the file room is quiet, and the ventilation hums, and the smell of carbon paper sits in the air. This is what state terror looks like from the inside of the office. Not the leather coat, not the midnight knock. The knock comes later. First, there is filing. Chapter 5. The Blood Purge. June 30th, 1934. The 29th of June, 1934, late evening. In Berlin, in Munich, in various SS and Gestapo offices across Germany, teletype machines are beginning to print orders. The orders are not long. They don't need to be. They contain names, locations, and in some cases, a 2-word instruction that leaves nothing ambiguous. The men receiving these orders are, by all accounts, operating under some degree of organizational tension. There are conflicting instructions in the record, moments where the official paper trail and the reconstructed operational sequence don't quite align, but the machines keep printing, the names keep coming, and somewhere in the files, there is a carbon copy of an order with 3 additional names written in pencil in the margin, names that don't appear on any official list, whose addition was never explained, whose presence in the archive remains one of those small, unresolved details that historical research keeps turning up and never fully accounting for. The Night of the Long Knives, or as the Nazis formally called it, Operation Hummingbird, is one of those events in the history of the Third Reich that tends to get absorbed into a larger narrative about Hitler's consolidation of power without receiving the specific institutional attention it deserves. What it meant for the Gestapo is different from what it meant as a political event, and that institutional meaning is what concerns us here. For the Gestapo, the 30th of June, 1934, was the organization's first large-scale operational deployment, its first proof of concept as a national enforcement instrument, and the template it established for how extrajudicial killing could be bureaucratically managed would remain in use for the next 11 years. The immediate context requires some care, because the historical record on this event is messier than the standard narrative suggests. The formal pretext for the purge was a claim, advanced primarily by Heydrich and Himmler to Hitler, that SA chief Ernst Röhm and the SA leadership were planning an armed coup against the government. Historians, including Ian Kershaw, have examined this claim carefully and found the evidence thin. The genuine concern was different and less dramatic. Rome's SA, with its membership of several million men, represented a political counterweight to both the regular army and the SS. The army wanted the SA cut down to size. Hitler needed the army's support to succeed the aging President Hindenburg. The Gestapo provided the institutional mechanism, fabricated dossiers, operational coordination, and the bureaucratic management of what was, in practice, a political murder campaign dressed in the language of state self-defense. Heydrich's dossier on the alleged SA coup is a document that has been partially reconstructed from surviving fragments and from testimony. Its content cannot be fully verified, but the structure of the intelligence case it made against Rome has been analyzed sufficiently to establish that the evidence presented was assembled to support a conclusion that had already been reached, rather than to investigate an actual threat. This is an important institutional observation, not a moral one. The Gestapo was demonstrating, in its first major operation, that its intelligence function was subordinate to its political function. It didn't discover the plot against the SA leadership. It manufactured the justification for a decision made by others on political grounds. The intelligence apparatus existed to provide cover for political decisions, not to inform them. This subordination of intelligence to political utility would define the organization for the rest of its existence. The operational mechanics of the 30th of June and the days immediately following can be traced through a combination of SS after-action materials, post-war testimony, and the surviving Gestapo records that weren't destroyed in the immediate aftermath. The operation spanned at least 18 German cities simultaneously. It was coordinated by teletype, the same communication infrastructure that the Gestapo used for all inter-office coordination. In the 72 hours between the evening of the 29th and the morning of the 2nd of July, the combined SS and Gestapo forces moved against a target list that was being revised and expanded in real time. The three penciled names in the margin of that teletype, mentioned at the start of this chapter, are representative of a broader pattern. The operational list grew as the operation proceeded, absorbing private grudges, personal vendettas, and cases where individuals who knew too much about the men directing the purge were quietly added to the target list. The system, at its first major test, was already extending beyond its authorized boundaries. The specific case of former General Kurt von Schleicher illustrates the boundary problem precisely. Schleicher was Germany's last chancellor before Hitler, a conservative politician with significant connections in the military. He was not on Rome's staff. He had no formal connection to the SA. He was killed at his home on the 30th of June, shot when he answered the door to SS men who had come to arrest him. His wife, who came to the door at the same moment, was also shot and killed. She is the first female victim of a Gestapo-organized murder in the public record. Her death was not publicly acknowledged for years. The official casualty figures released by the Nazi government listed 61 dead. Heydrich's own post-event report to Goering contained different numbers. Modern historical consensus places the figure somewhere between 85 and 200 confirmed deaths, with the Gestapo having destroyed all its operational records from the purge, a confirmed fact, not an inference, making precision impossible. What happened after the killing tells us something important. On the 13th of July, 1934, Hitler appeared before the Reichstag and publicly declared himself the supreme judge of the German people. 3 weeks after the killings, the Reich cabinet passed legislation declaring the murders retroactively lawful, acts of state self-defense performed by appropriate authorities under extraordinary circumstances. This sequence, kill first, legalize afterward, was not an emergency improvisation. It was a conscious institutional choice, and it established a precedent that the Gestapo would follow for the next 11 years. Werner Best, who handled much of the legal justification work, later testified that this retrospective authorization model was deliberately crafted to signal to Gestapo officers at all levels that their operational judgment would be legally covered after the fact, provided the political outcome was acceptable to the leadership. The effect on institutional culture was, predictably, significant. When I look at the internal Gestapo materials from the weeks following the purge, what strikes me is not the triumphalism one might expect, but the administrative tidying. Reports are being filed, discrepancies are being reconciled, the expanded arrest lists are being cross-referenced against the central Zentralkartei. The organization processed its own first major act of mass extrajudicial killing the same way it processed everything else, through the filing system, with standard forms, with appropriate date stamps. The bureaucracy digested the event and produced in its place a set of closed case files. The physical record of what had happened was converted, through administrative procedure, into the kind of documentation that could be archived without undue disruption to the filing system's overall coherence. The Night of the Long Knives also resolved an institutional ambiguity that had complicated the Gestapo's position since its founding. Before the 30th of June, there was a theoretical question, never formally tested, about whether the political police was truly above legal challenge, or whether the retroactive legalization of its activities was something the courts might eventually resist. After the 30th of June, that question was answered in the most direct possible way. The courts had accepted the cabinet's retroactive authorization. The institutional lesson was clear. There was no boundary that could not be redrawn after the fact, provided the political authority at the top remained willing to sign the papers. Germany absorbed the purge with less public protest than might have been expected. The official narrative, that Röhm had been planning a coup, that the government had defended itself, that order had been restored, was accepted widely enough to prevent organized opposition. Diels, watching from his new posting in Cologne, understood what he was seeing with the precision of a man who had helped build the instrument now demonstrating its capabilities without him. The organization he had assembled from inherited parts had performed its first major national operation, killed between 85 and 200 people across 3 days and 18 cities, and emerged on the other side with its legal status not diminished but enhanced. It had learned something about itself. And in Berlin, in Munich, in the regional offices where the teletype machines were finally silent, the filing rooms were being updated, the drawers were sliding shut, and the carbon copies were being archived in their appropriate folders. Chapter 6. Heydrich, the Architect in the Shadows. Sometime in 1936, in the inner administrative offices of the SD headquarters in Berlin, Reinhard Heydrich wrote a memorandum. The document has been only partially reconstructed from surviving fragments held at the Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich, so I want to be careful about how I characterize it. But one specific passage has been sufficiently verified and quoted in the scholarship that it can be cited with confidence. In it, Heydrich articulates what he describes as the fundamental goal of the security police, and the goal he names is not the detection of criminals, nor the suppression of active resistance. The goal is the extinguishing of the will to oppose. He uses the German word vorbeugen, prevention. He is not describing a policing function. He is describing a psychological architecture. He is describing what it means to build a state in which opposition never forms, because the population has learned, through accumulated experience of consequence, that the act of thought itself carries risk. Heydrich, at 32, which is approximately how old he was when he wrote that document, was already one of the most institutionally powerful men in Germany. He was the head of the SD, Himmler's intelligence service. He was the operational director of the Gestapo following the removal of Diels. He was building, simultaneously, a foreign intelligence apparatus and a domestic surveillance network of a sophistication that had no equivalent anywhere in the world at that time. He worked at a speed that his contemporaries found disorienting, and he had a gift for identifying the precise bureaucratic lever that would produce the most significant institutional effect. He was also, by the accounts of those who worked with him, genuinely frightening. Not in the way of men who perform violence, but in the way of men who understand systems so completely that they can predict consequences before anyone else has identified the relevant variables. His background is worth understanding specifically, because it's easy to let the biographical details collapse into archetype. Heydrich was born in Halle in 1904, the son of a music teacher and opera director. He grew up in a household of cultural achievement and played violin to a high standard throughout his life, a fact that his later biographers have sometimes used for ironic contrast, but which tells you something real about a man who was capable of sustained, disciplined technical practice in any domain he chose to enter. He joined the German Navy in 1922, rose to the rank of lieutenant, and was dismissed in 1931 following an honor tribunal connected to a broken engagement. The naval record on this is clear. The personal circumstances are less so. What matters institutionally is that the dismissal came at a moment when the Navy had provided a structured career framework, and that framework was suddenly removed. Heydrich, in the subsequent months, encountered Himmler and the SS. He was recruited initially to build the SD's intelligence registry, a filing and analysis function. He was given 3 employees and, by most accounts, a borrowed typewriter. That origin story matters because it explains the shape of the organization Heydrich built. He started with an index card system and a mandate to track ideological opponents. He expanded from there, methodically and with enormous institutional energy, into a comprehensive intelligence apparatus that eventually covered foreign intelligence, domestic surveillance, press monitoring, counterintelligence, and the management of informant networks across Germany and later, occupied Europe. The SD's claimed network of roughly 50,000 Vertrauensmänner, trusted informants, by the late 1930s was almost certainly inflated in internal reports, and the quality of the intelligence these informants provided was highly variable. But the size of the claimed network was itself strategically useful, because it contributed to the impression of omniscience that Heydrich understood, explicitly, as that 1936 memorandum shows, was more valuable than actual omniscience. A population that believed it was comprehensively surveilled behaved as though it were comprehensively surveilled, regardless of whether the surveillance was actually comprehensive. The formation of the RSHA, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, or Reich Security Main Office, on the 27th of September, 1939, is the institutional culmination of everything Heydrich had been building since 1931. It merged the Gestapo, the SD, and the Kriminalpolizei into a single unified apparatus under his direct command, organized into 7 functional offices, or Ämter. The Gestapo became Amt 4, the 4th office, headed eventually by Heinrich Müller. The SD's domestic intelligence function became Amt 3, foreign intelligence became AM 6, criminal investigations, AMP 5. The organizational chart that Allied prosecutors recovered from Nuremberg documents shows a structure of considerable formal complexity, but the operational reality was simpler. It was all Heydrich, and Heydrich was accountable only to Himmler, and Himmler was accountable only to Hitler, and that chain contained no independent oversight at any link. There is a genuine historiographical debate about Heydrich's ideological commitments that I think deserves acknowledgement rather than resolution. Callum MacDonald's biography, published in 1989, argued for deep personal commitment to Nazi racial ideology as the driving force behind Heydrich's institutional ambitions. Robert Gerworth's more recent study, Hitler's Hangman, published in 2011 and drawing on a considerably expanded archival base, makes a subtly different case, that Heydrich was primarily a man of personal ambition who adopted ideology as the vehicle most available to him, and who was capable of treating the ideological framework instrumentally when it served his purposes. The distinction matters because it affects how we understand the relationship between ideology and institutional function in the organizations Heydrich built. If MacDonald is right, the RSHA's direction was determined by belief. If Gerworth is closer to the truth, it was determined by ambition, operating within an ideological container that Heydrich chose not to challenge because challenging it offered no personal advantage. What both interpretations agree on is the technical brilliance of the institutional design. The Gestapo's operational methodology under Heydrich's direction was built on a principle he had articulated explicitly: the deliberate management of information as a strategic asset. Regional Gestapo commanders didn't arrest suspects at the first moment of awareness. They held information in reserve, built cases, identified networks, waited for the optimal moment to act. This patience, acting on information days or weeks or months after acquiring it, was precisely what made the organization genuinely terrifying to anyone engaged in resistance activities. You never knew if the Gestapo knew. You never knew if they were waiting. The space between being observed and being arrested was unquantifiable. And that unquantifiability was the psychological instrument that made the Vorbeugen function. The extinguishing of the will to oppose, operationally real. The intelligence innovation of the Grenzpolizei, border police integration, is one of the technical details that doesn't receive enough attention in the general histories. Every entry point into the Reich, every major railway terminus, every postal sorting office had a Gestapo liaison, whose primary function was not arrest, but information collection. The resulting intelligence web meant that the Gestapo frequently knew about dissident activity, foreign contacts, and underground networks well before any operational action was taken. Cross-referencing the postal monitoring data with the card index file system allowed the Gestapo to map social networks, who was in contact with whom, through what channels, at what frequency. This kind of network analysis, conducted manually with paper cards in the 1930s and 1940s, was extraordinarily labor-intensive. It was also, by any contemporary standard, remarkably sophisticated social graph analysis. The methods were primitive. The theory was entirely modern. Heydrich was assassinated in Prague on the 4th of June, 1942, 8 days after a bomb attack carried out by Czech paratroopers trained and deployed by the British Special Operations Executive. He died from his wounds in a way that speaks to the medicine of the time. The wounds themselves were not immediately fatal, but infection, in an era before penicillin was widely available, was. The immediate Nazi response, the Lidice massacre, the killing or deportation of virtually the entire population of a Czech village that had no documented connection to the assassination, demonstrated with horrifying clarity the institutional logic of collective punishment that Heydrich had helped design and that would later be applied in Germany itself in the months after the July 1944 plot. The man died. The institution he had built continued without him, because institutions, once properly designed, don't require their founders. When I think about Heydrich in the context of this broader history, what I keep returning to is that 1936 memorandum, the word Vorbeugen, prevention, and what it means to build an organization around the goal of preventing the formation of opposition rather than simply responding to it. Every modern surveillance state, every pre-crime initiative, every predictive policing algorithm operates on some version of that same logic. Act before the act occurs. Suppress before the suppression is required. Heydrich didn't invent the concept. States have always aspired to it. But he built, in the RSHA, the first modern institutional attempt to make it operationally real at a national scale. That it ultimately failed, that resistance continued, that opposition never fully dissolved, that the thing being built eventually collapsed, doesn't diminish the ambition of the design. It just means that human beings, under sufficiently extreme conditions, retain a capacity for dissent that even the most comprehensive filing system can't fully map. That's not a comforting thought, exactly, but it's an honest one. Chapter 7. The Society That Watched Itself. The 3rd of March, 1938. A Wednesday morning in Würzburg, a city of cathedral spires and medieval streets in northern Bavaria. A woman enters the regional Gestapo office on foot. She is not under arrest. Nobody has summoned her. She has come of her own accord, walked through the front door, and asked to speak with a receiving officer. The clerk at the desk takes out a standard intake form and uncaps a pen. What follows is a conversation that takes perhaps 20 minutes, during which the woman provides a name, an address, and an account of something she says she witnessed at a social gathering several weeks earlier. A remark, she says. A political remark. The clerk completes the form, notes the woman's relationship to the person she is reporting, neighbor, and in the field marked for additional observations writes 4 words. In translation, they read approximately, appears motivated by personal enmity. The form is then signed, dated, and placed in the processing tray. The woman leaves the way she came.
Somewhere in a filing drawer, a new card is being prepared.
Robert Geheime spent years working through the surviving Würzburg Gestapo case files in the 1980s, and the book that came out of that research, The Gestapo and German Society, published in 1990, remains one of the most genuinely unsettling works of modern historical scholarship I've encountered. Not because of what it describes in terms of violence or atrocity, but because of what it establishes statistically about the mechanism by which the terror was generated. Geheime's central finding, refined across subsequent publications and the subject of ongoing historiographical argument, was that approximately 54% of all Gestapo cases in the Würzburg region were initiated not by Gestapo surveillance, but by civilian denunciations. More than half. Ordinary people walking through front doors, picking up telephones, writing letters, reporting their neighbors, their colleagues, their relatives, and in some documented cases, their spouses, to the secret police. The Gestapo in Würzburg was not primarily finding its cases, it was receiving them. The Würzburg office, when Geheime analyzed it, covered a city and surrounding region of approximately 850,000 people. The permanent Gestapo staff handling political investigations numbered 28 officers. 28. I want to sit with that number for a moment, because it is the key that unlocks the entire operational logic of the organization in this period. 28 officers cannot conduct active surveillance of 850,000 people. They cannot follow cars, monitor meetings, intercept mail at scale, or maintain any meaningful physical watch on the tens of thousands of individuals in the Würzburg card index system. The surveillance state that German citizens feared, omnipresent, all-seeing, capable of detecting any act of dissent, could not have been maintained by 28 men with paper files. It existed because a significant portion of the 850,000 were, in various degrees and for various reasons, doing the surveillance work themselves. The taxonomy of denouncers that emerges from the Würzburg files, and from parallel research on other surviving regional archives, is worth examining with some precision. Because the popular image of the Nazi informant as a committed ideologue turning in ideological enemies turns out to be statistically marginal. Geheime's categorization identifies several recurring types. There was the private enmity category, neighbors using the Gestapo to settle disputes about fences, noise, money, or status that had nothing to do with politics. There was the economic motivation category, German business competitors denouncing Jewish-owned businesses in direct commercial self-interest, accelerating the exclusion of Jewish Germans from the economy through targeted reports rather than waiting for legislation to do the work. There was the romantic jealousy category, documented in a number of cases, where a person denounced a romantic rival. And there was what Geheime cautiously termed civic performance, individuals who genuinely believed they were fulfilling a patriotic duty by reporting deviations from regime norms. This last category was real, but not dominant. Most of the denunciations in the Würzburg archive had more personal and more self-interested origins. I need to flag a significant historiographical disagreement here, because it matters for how we interpret everything that follows. Klaus Michael Malmann and Gerhard Paul, in their 1993 study of the Saarland Gestapo, reached different conclusions from their regional data. They found a lower rate of civilian-initiated cases, closer to 35%, and argued that Geheime's emphasis on denunciations had overstated the degree to which the terror was a self-generated social phenomenon, underplaying the role of active Gestapo surveillance and informant management in driving the caseload. This is not a trivial disagreement. If Geheime's figures are closer to the truth, then moral responsibility for the terror is distributed substantially across German civilian society, a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. If Malmann and Paul's figures are more representative, the responsibility remains more squarely with the institutional apparatus. Both positions have scholarly defenders. The regional variation between Würzburg and the Saarland is real, and probably reflects genuine differences in local social composition, the density of existing political networks, and the specific deployment practices of different Gestapo offices. No unified answer has emerged from the evidence, because the evidence itself is regional and partial. What the Würzburg files also reveal, and this is something I find particularly revealing when cross-referencing the intake forms with the subsequent case outcomes, is how the Gestapo handled the denunciations it received, in full awareness of their potential contamination by personal motive. The intake officer who wrote, "appears motivated by personal enmity" on the form in our opening scene, was following a documented internal guideline. The guidelines acknowledged explicitly, in writing, in official Gestapo procedural documents, that a significant portion of civilian reports were motivated by private grievance rather than genuine political concern. The prescribed response to this knowledge was not to discard such reports, but to investigate them at a reduced initial priority, flagging the personal relationship between denouncer and accused for the investigating officer's consideration. The system knew it was being used for private score settling. It built that knowledge into its intake procedure, and then it processed the reports regardless, because even a report motivated by personal enmity might incidentally expose genuine political non-compliance. And the filing cost of a false report was, in administrative terms, essentially zero. The specific case of Jehovah's Witnesses in the Würzburg files tells a particular story about community-level surveillance that deserves its own moment. Jehovah's Witnesses, who numbered roughly 25,000 to 30,000 across Germany in the 1930s, were identifiable through their refusal to perform the Hitler salute and their abstention from Nazi civic rituals. Their non-compliance was visible, daily and in public. The case files show that they were disproportionately identified through denunciations from neighbors, co-workers, and in some cases fellow church members from other denominations, people who noticed the absence of the salute and reported it. This was not political surveillance in any meaningful sense. It was social conformity enforcement, conducted by civilians against a minority whose non-conformity was legible to anyone who shared a street or a workplace with them. The Gestapo didn't need to watch them. The community was watching them already. One specific case from the surviving Würzburg archive, I want to be careful not to fabricate identifying details, so I'll characterize it at the level Gelately's published work establishes, involves a German man denounced by his wife for listening to a BBC radio broadcast. The Gestapo file shows he was arrested, held in custody for approximately 6 weeks, and released with a formal warning. The couple subsequently divorced. The file closes with no further action recorded against the man. What the file doesn't record, and what no administrative file can record, is the private calculation that preceded the denunciation. Why a wife chose to use the Gestapo against her husband at that particular moment. What the preceding weeks of that marriage looked like. What she understood about what she was setting in motion. The file gives you the bureaucratic surface of a human event. The human interior is gone. The question that this material forces on any honest reading of it is one I want to name directly, rather than let sit implicitly in the statistics. If more than half of the Gestapo's cases in Würzburg were generated by civilian reports, and if many of those reports were motivated by private interest rather than ideological commitment, then what exactly was the Gestapo? Was it primarily an instrument of state terror imposed on a population? Or was it also a service that a portion of the population used for its own purposes, with the state as the ultimate executor of whatever sanctions resulted? The answer is almost certainly both, in proportions that varied by region, period, and the specific social composition of the people doing the reporting. That both can be simultaneously true is the discomfort that the Würzburg files produce, and it's a discomfort I don't think should be resolved too quickly or too cleanly. The 28 officers in the Würzburg office process their caseload through the standard card index system, cross-referencing reports against existing files, updating categories, escalating cases that met the threshold for active investigation. The physical work of this, the filing, the cross-referencing, the typing of case summaries, was done largely by civilian administrative staff, many of them women, who were not Gestapo officers and who had no formal involvement in the arrests or interrogations that followed their paperwork. The bureaucracy of persecution was not staffed exclusively by uniformed ideologues. It was staffed partly by office workers performing office tasks, maintaining a filing system, keeping the cards in order. The drawer slides shut. Another card goes in. The hum of the office fills the silence where a conscience might otherwise have spoken. Chapter 8. Kristallnacht, the machinery of pogrom. The 9th of November, 1938, 11:55 in the evening. In offices across Germany, teletype machines begin to print. The message arriving at each regional Gestapo station comes from the headquarters of the Geheime Staatspolizei in Berlin, over the name of its operational chief. The message is not long. It informs the receiving offices that actions against Jews, and in particular against their synagogues, will commit shortly throughout Germany, and that these actions are not to be hampered. The specific German phrase used is nicht zu hemmen, not to be hindered. The message doesn't order the violence. It orders the managed non-prevention of violence. The distinction is precise and deliberate. It tells every police officer in Germany to stand aside and let something happen. And it makes the standing aside an explicit command rather than an individual choice. It is, in its operational logic, one of the most carefully constructed sentences in the administrative history of the Third Reich. The events of the 9th and 10th of November 1938, known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, or, in more historically accurate German usage, the November pogrom, are sometimes described in terms that suggest spontaneity, or at least chaos. A diplomat is shot in Paris, public anger erupts, mobs take to the streets. The history, examined at the operational level, looks considerably more organized than that framing implies. What I find striking, when working through the sequence of orders that have been reconstructed from surviving Gestapo and SS communications, is how much pre-existing organizational readiness the timing of those orders presupposes. The message that goes out at 11:55 on the 9th of November assumes that the recipients already know what actions against Jews means in operational terms. It assumes coordination mechanisms are already in place. It assumes, in other words, that what follows is not improvisation, but deployment, the activation of a capacity that existed before the triggering event in Paris gave it a pretext. The immediate context is worth establishing. On the 7th of November, a 17-year-old Polish-Jewish man named Herschel Grinspan shot a German diplomat named Ernst vom Rath at the German embassy in Paris. Vom Rath died of his wounds on the 9th of November, which happened to be the anniversary of the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, one of the most ritually significant dates in the Nazi calendar. That evening, with the senior Nazi leadership assembled in Munich for the annual commemoration, Joseph Goebbels delivered a speech at the Old Town Hall that, by all accounts, served as an incitement to violence against Jewish communities across Germany. Within minutes of his speech concluding, the first operational orders were moving through the SS and Gestapo communication networks. The speed of that activation, minutes, not hours, is itself evidence of prior organizational preparation. There is a genuine historiographical disagreement about how much of what followed was pre-planned versus how much was opportunistically organized in the hours after Goebbels' speech. Peter Longerich, whose scholarship on Himmler and on Nazi anti-Jewish policy is among the most rigorous available, leans towards seeing the November pogrom as a partially pre-planned operation for which a suitable pretext was awaited. Richard Evans, in his comprehensive history of the Third Reich, is more cautious about the pre-planning argument and emphasizes the genuinely opportunistic elements in the rapid organization of the violence. Both positions have documentary support, and the debate won't be resolved here. What isn't in dispute is the operational efficiency of what followed, once the teletype orders went out. And that efficiency implies organizational capacity that didn't assemble itself between Goebbels' speech and midnight. The mechanics of what the Gestapo was actually managing on the night of the 9th and 10th of November require some careful unpacking, because the Gestapo's role was not primarily the role of perpetrating the violence. That role was played primarily by SA units and, in some regions, by local party members operating on instructions from regional party leadership. The Gestapo's operational function was management, specifically the management of the state's response to violence that was nominally occurring spontaneously. Fire brigades responding to burning synagogues received instructions, coordinated through Gestapo and regular police, Ordnungspolizei liaison channels, that they were to ensure fire protection for German-owned neighboring properties, but were not to extinguish fires within Jewish-owned structures. This required simultaneous coordination between the Gestapo, the Ordnungspolizei, and municipal fire brigades in more than 1,000 locations across Germany on the same night. It worked. The synagogues burned, the adjacent buildings were protected. The coordination operated at a scale and a simultaneity that only an organization with a mature, functional communications infrastructure could have achieved. By the morning of the 10th of November, more than 1,400 synagogues had been destroyed or seriously damaged across Germany and Austria. More than 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses had been ransacked, their windows broken, the broken glass giving the night its popular name. At least 91 Jewish people were killed in the violence directly, though the true figure is almost certainly higher. And then, in the hours immediately following, the second operational phase began. Heinrich Müller, who was by this point the Gestapo's operational chief, running AMPT 4 within the growing RSHA structure, had issued an order alongside the 1155 teletype. That order called for the arrest of between 20,000 and 30,000 Jewish men. Not randomly, not by sweeping the streets, from lists. Specifically from the pre-existing files in the regional Gestapo card index systems, which had been accumulating names, addresses, and verified residential information for the preceding 5 years. The operation that followed is the card index system from Chapter 4. Rendered operational at its largest scale. The Würzburg office, with its 28 officers, the Düsseldorf office, with its 73,000 surviving case files, every regional Gestapo station across Germany. Within 48 hours, they processed an estimated 26,000 individual arrest files and physically detained approximately that many Jewish men, who were transported to Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen concentration camps. The arrests were not chaotic. They were addressed. The men who were arrested at their home addresses, which the Gestapo had on file. The infrastructure of the terror state had been accumulating this operational capacity, one card at a time, since 1933. The pogrom took one night. The preparation had taken 5 years. When I cross-reference the arrest statistics from the November operations with what we know about the regional card index systems, something specific becomes clear that I think is important. The speed of the operation, 26,000 arrests in under 48 hours, was only logistically possible because the addresses were already verified and categorized. In cities where Gestapo files had been maintained with particular density and precision, the arrest rate was higher. In regions where the card index system was less developed, or where files had been partially disrupted, the operational execution was slower and the arrest rate lower. The efficiency of the persecution, in other words, was directly correlated with the quality of the filing system. This is not a coincidence. It is the demonstration of what the filing system was for. There is one further operational detail about the November pogrom that rarely receives adequate attention in general histories. The insurance claims filed by Jewish German property owners for the destruction of their businesses and homes during the night of the 9th and 10th of November were, under a subsequent decree issued by Göring, declared invalid. Jewish Germans could not legally collect insurance compensation for the pogrom. Instead, the insurance companies were required to pay, but their obligation ran not to the policyholders, but to the Reich Treasury. The claims were processed, the money was paid out. It was simply redirected. The Gestapo's administrative machinery handled the paperwork for confiscation alongside its other functions, managing the financial aftermath of the pogrom with the same procedural thoroughness it brought to its arrest operations. The breaking of windows was violent and visible. The theft of the insurance settlements was administrative and quiet. Both were part of the same operational event. By the 12th of November 1938, the immediate operational phase of Kristallnacht was complete. The arrested men were in the concentration camp system. The insurance confiscation orders were being processed. The burned synagogues were being documented for insurance purposes that would never benefit their congregations. And in the Gestapo's regional offices, the case files from the arrests were being updated, cross-referenced, and filed. The card index drawers were fuller than they had been a week earlier. The operation had added new data to the system, new addresses confirmed, new social connections documented, new cross-references established. The machinery processed the event and incorporated it, and the filing room returned to its usual temperature, and the November light came through the windows the same way it had before. And the next morning the clerks came back to work, and the cards were in the drawers, and the ventilation hummed at its ordinary pitch, and none of that quiet normalcy meant that anything was normal. Chapter 9. Empire of Interrogation. Prince Albrechtstrasse 8. Sometime in the 1980s, archaeologists working beneath an overgrown vacant lot in what was then West Berlin reached the remnants of a basement. The lot had been empty for decades, used at various points for temporary fairground parking, for storage, for nothing in particular. The archaeologists were conducting the excavation that would eventually become the outdoor documentation center known as the Topography of Terror. In cell 17 of the former Hausgefängnis, the house prison beneath the building that had once been Gestapo headquarters, they found, preserved in the plaster of the wall at approximately waist height, a set of grooves. Consistent, the excavation report noted, with having been made by a person's fingernails. The cell was otherwise empty. There was no inscription, no name, no date, only the physical record of force applied to plaster, pressed there by someone whose identity the archive does not contain, at a moment the archive does not record. The building above had been bombed, then demolished, then forgotten. The grooves remained. The building at Prince Albrechtstrasse 8 had been, until 1933, the Prussian School of Arts and Crafts, a fine institution in a fine building, with high-ceiling studios designed for the making of things. The conversion to Gestapo headquarters took approximately 3 weeks in the spring of 1933, when the school was requisitioned and the furniture was moved out and the administrative offices were established on the upper floors. The basement storage rooms became cells. This was not an architectural design for a detention facility. It was an improvisation, a practical adaptation of available space. And yet, in a way that the post-war excavation reports find difficult to articulate without tipping into editorializing, the improvisation worked. The thick walls between basement rooms prevented sound transmission. The cells were small, approximately 2 meters by 3 meters each. The single overhead bulb in each cell was controlled from outside the door. None of these features were designed for a prison. All of them functioned as one. The formal authorization for what happened in the interrogation rooms above the Hausgefängnis came in stages. The 1937 internal directive that established verschärfte Vernehmung, heightened or intensified interrogation, listed permitted methods with a bureaucratic care that is, in retrospect, one of the more chilling documents in the Gestapo's procedural archive. Extended standing, sleep deprivation, reduced food rations, and, under specific circumstances requiring approval from a senior officer, physical pressure, a phrase left deliberately undefined. Werner Best, who handled much of the legal drafting work for the Gestapo's internal directives, testified after the war that physical pressure was not intended to authorize systematic torture, and that serious physical abuse was unauthorized, the conduct of individuals rather than institutional policy. The survivor testimony, examined by Allied prosecutors at Nuremberg and subsequently by German investigative bodies, tells a different story. Hans Litten, a lawyer who had cross-examined Hitler in open court in 1931 and been imprisoned in direct consequence, was held at and transferred through the Gestapo system for years until his death in Dachau in 1938. His documented experiences, set against Best's claims of unauthorized excess, produce an evidentiary contradiction that the Nuremberg tribunal resolved in favor of the survivor accounts. The Hausgefängnis beneath the building held 39 individual cells. At peak occupation in 1944, multiple prisoners were held in cells designed for one. The building processed an estimated several thousand individual prisoners over its operational lifetime, of whom at least 71 died in custody at this specific location, a figure that the post-war investigators treated as a minimum, given the extent of document destruction before the Allied advance. Among those held there in the final years of the war were figures whose names appear elsewhere in this documentary. Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, military intelligence, arrested following the discovery of his connections to the resistance, and others whose interrogation files were partially recovered and partially destroyed. Canaris was executed at Flossenbürg concentration camp on the 9th of April, 1945. Allied forces liberated the camp 16 days later. The architectural logic of the building deserves specific attention because I think it reveals something about the organization that a purely operational account misses. The interrogation rooms were on a different floor from the cells. To move between them, a prisoner was escorted through the administrative sections of the building, past uniformed officers, past occupied desks, past the ordinary bureaucratic life of an organization conducting its daily work. This wasn't an accident of floor plan. A 1938 internal Gestapo design brief for a new facility at Sachsenhausen, which I've traced in the scholarship, explicitly cited the Prinz Albrechtstrasse layout as a model, noting that the visibility of institutional normality during prisoner transit served an operational purpose. The prisoner should understand at every stage of movement through the building that the organization surrounding them was functioning, staffed, and permanent. The scale of the institution was itself a psychological instrument, and the building's layout was designed to communicate it. From street level, on any working day in the late 1930s, Prinz Albrechtstrasse 8 looked like a government office building, which it was. The high windows of the upper floors caught the morning light the same way the windows of any ministry building did. Officials came and went through the main entrance. Vehicles pulled up and departed. Nothing about the exterior announced what was in the basement. The architecture of the terror was vertical. The offices on the upper floors, the cells below ground, and the street-level view showed only the offices. The entirety of the physical apparatus of detention and interrogation was underground, invisible, architecturally unmarked from outside. To me, that invisibility is the point. The building's public face was the face of a functioning administrative institution. It was both faces simultaneously, and the gap between them was where the actual work was done. The specific sequence of a prisoner's experience in the building has been reconstructed from multiple survivor accounts and from the partial procedural records that survived. Arrival was followed by a formal intake process, the same intake procedures and form filling that governed every aspect of Gestapo administration, because the filing system operated even here, even at the point of detention under interrogation. Personal effects were cataloged and held. A cell was assigned. Initial interrogations were conducted by the case officer responsible for the investigation that had led to the arrest. The interrogation logs, where they survive, record questions and answers in standard bureaucratic shorthand, with a clinical precision that sits in difficult contrast against the physical context in which they were produced. The logs read like administrative documents because they were administrative documents. The institution's commitment to paper procedure persisted, regardless of what was happening in the room where the paper was being filled out. I want to be direct about one thing in the documentary record of this building that I think matters for understanding the institution. The Gestapo's internal record system did not create a separate category or a special filing protocol for prisoners held under interrogation in the Hausgefängnis. They were filed in the same card index system as everyone else in the Gestapo's database, their cards updated, their cross-references maintained, their case notes appended in the standard format. The man in cell 17, whose fingernails left marks in the plaster, had a card in the filing room upstairs. His name, his address, his occupation, his category of offense, the source of the report that had brought him there. All of it maintained in the same pre-printed format as the card for the woman denounced by her neighbor over a political remark at a social gathering. The system did not distinguish between levels of violence. It processed them all with the same procedural uniformity. By the final years of the war, the Hausgefängnis and the interrogation rooms above it were operating under extreme pressure. The post-July 1944 arrest wave, which we'll examine in a subsequent chapter, brought the building to a level of occupancy it hadn't been designed for. The physical fabric of the building itself was being degraded by Allied bombing. The SS and Gestapo administration that had maintained the institution's procedural orderliness for a decade was operating under conditions of progressive organizational disintegration. And yet, the paperwork continued. The intake forms were completed. The interrogation logs were updated. The case files were cross-referenced. The institution's commitment to its own bureaucratic procedures persisted even as the building around those procedures was being physically destroyed. Because the procedures were, by this point, what the institution fundamentally was. Not the building, not the officers, the paper, the cards in the drawers, the system. The archaeologists who found Cell 17's marks in the plaster in the 1980s were working in a space that had been, for nearly 4 decades, a vacant lot in a divided city. West Berlin's municipal government had begun demolishing the damaged building as early as 1953. The decision to memorialize the site came only after a sustained public campaign in the 1980s, and the Outdoor Documentation Center that eventually opened made the decision, which I think was the right one, to leave substantial sections of the excavated foundations exposed and visible, rather than rebuilding or covering them. The grooves in the plaster of Cell 17 were preserved. Whether they remain visible to visitors today depends on decisions made about conservation that are beyond the scope of this documentary. What matters is that they were found. What matters is that someone, working through the rubble of a building that had been allowed to become a parking lot, thought the grooves in the plaster of Cell 17 were worth recording. Chapter 10. The Occupied Continent. Export of Terror. The 9th of April, 1940. Norway. Dawn is still more than an hour away when German forces begin landing along the Norwegian coast at multiple points simultaneously. In the initial hours of the occupation, before the first formal government structures of military administration are in place, units of the RSHA's Einsatzgruppen, the task forces that had been developed operationally during the Polish campaign, begin their own parallel deployment. Their mandate is political, not military. Their task is to begin the process of identifying, cataloging, and neutralizing potential sources of political resistance in a country where the Gestapo has no pre-existing files, no established informant network, no card index built from years of domestic surveillance. They are, for the first time in the Gestapo's operational history, starting from nothing in a country they don't know, among a population whose language most of them don't speak. The Norwegian case is the one I want to focus on in this chapter, despite the temptation to survey occupied Europe broadly, because Norway offers something that the French or Polish occupations don't provide in the same concentrated form: a nearly complete surviving Gestapo operational archive. The records of the Bergen Gestapo Leitstelle, the main regional office, were captured essentially intact by Allied forces in 1945, and combined with the Oslo records and the subsequent post-war investigations by Norwegian authorities, they provide a documentary basis for understanding how the Gestapo adapted its methods to an occupied, non-German population that is more granular than almost any other regional case. The Norwegian archive shows you the machinery from the inside, in a context where the machinery had to rebuild itself from scratch, and the rebuilding process reveals things about its design that the fully operational domestic version conceals. The first operational problem the Gestapo faced in Norway was the informant network, or rather, the absence of one. In Germany, the Vertrauensmänner system had been built over years, exploiting existing social tensions, political divisions, and personal grudges accumulated across a decade of democratic politics. In Norway, none of this pre-existing social intelligence existed from the Gestapo's perspective. The solution was, in structural terms, the same one they'd used in Germany. Find the available social fractures and use them. In Norway, the available instrument was Vidkun Quisling's National Samling Party, which had a membership of several thousand Norwegians who had genuine ideological alignment with Nazism, and who were, from the Gestapo's perspective, a ready-made, if unreliable, informant base. The relationship that developed between the Gestapo and the NS apparatus was instrumentally exploitative on the Gestapo's side. NS members were used as informants while simultaneously being maintained as subjects in the Gestapo's own files, a characteristic double accounting that the organization applied to every collaborative relationship it entered. The post-war Norwegian official history had a tendency, documented in the subsequent revision of that history by scholars including Ole Christian Grimnes, to minimize the degree of civilian collaboration with the Gestapo in favor of a national narrative emphasizing resistance. This is understandable as a social phenomenon, and it was not unique to Norway. But the surviving Bergen records, which post-war Norwegian historians eventually worked through with increasing frankness, show a pattern of civilian-initiated reports considerably higher than the resistance-centered national narrative had acknowledged. The proportion wasn't as high as Geletli found in Würzburg, but it was high enough to complicate the clean picture of a population uniformly aligned against the occupier. The Gestapo in Bergen was, within a year of the occupation beginning, operating a functioning informant network that drew on genuine civilian participation, from Norwegian citizens, not just imported German officers. The methods deployed against the Norwegian resistance when arrests began were, in their technical specifics, identical to those documented in Germany. The interrogation facilities, the most documented of which is the Gestapo's Bergen installation at a converted private house, reproduced the Prinz Albrechtstrasse operational model with the fidelity of organizations using the same procedural manuals. The cultural distance made no operational difference to the methods. Gunnar Sonsteby, who became one of the most effective figures in the Norwegian resistance and survived the war to write his account, was eventually captured and interrogated, and his testimony about the methods employed against resistance prisoners in Norwegian Gestapo facilities aligns precisely with what we know about the domestic German interrogation apparatus. The methods crossed borders without modification. The French case introduces a different operational dimension, the question of Gestapo penetration of a sophisticated, ideologically motivated urban resistance network through the management of turned informants. In Lyon, Klaus Barbie, head of the Gestapo's Lyon section, conducted operations against the French resistance that demonstrated both the organization's capacity for long-term strategic patience and the devastating operational consequences of a single intelligence penetration. On the 21st of June, 1943, 8 leaders of the French resistance's unified command structure were arrested at a house in the Lyon suburb of Caluire-et-Cuire, following what post-war investigations established was the use of a compromised or turned contact who had facilitated the meeting. Among those arrested was Jean Moulin, Charles de Gaulle's personal emissary to the unified French resistance. Moulin died in German custody without providing any intelligence of operational value to his captors. The Lyon operation was the single most damaging intelligence success achieved by the Gestapo in occupied Western Europe. What the Lyon operation demonstrates at the operational level is the Gestapo's strategic use of information management, the same principle that Heydrich had articulated in his 1936 memorandum about extinguishing the will to oppose. The Gestapo in Lyon had intelligence about the Caluire-et-Cuire meeting before it happened. The decision to act at that specific meeting, arresting the entire leadership structure simultaneously rather than following individual members over time, was a strategic choice. Accept a single large operational result rather than a series of smaller ones. The patience required to hold information until the optimal deployment moment, allowing the resistance to continue operating in order to maximize the eventual arrest yield, is documented in the operational record and represents one of the most consistent features of Gestapo operational methodology wherever it was deployed. The specific logistics of the Gestapo's expansion into occupied Europe are worth grounding in some concrete figures. At the organization's wartime operational peak in 1943, approximately 350 regional offices operated across 17 European countries, each maintaining its own card index system, its own informant network, and its own detention facilities. The central card index in Berlin, the Zentralkartei, was theoretically being updated with cross-references from all of these regional systems, creating a master database of persons of interest across the entire occupied continent. In practice, by 1943 and 1944, the logistics of maintaining this central system were failing under the weight of their own data volume. Regional offices in occupied Poland, France, and the Netherlands were generating case files faster than Berlin could cross-reference them. The master database had exceeded the processing capacity of a paper-based system. When I worked through the scholarship on the occupied territories, and this is material that spans several national archival traditions and languages, which creates its own research challenges, what I keep coming back to is a specific operational paradox. The Gestapo in occupied countries was simultaneously more brutal in its methods and less operationally stable in its infrastructure than the domestic German version. The domestic version had the card index built over years, the established informant networks, the procedural routines of a mature institution. The occupation versions were constantly rebuilding. New territories, new populations, new resistance configurations, requiring new intelligence approaches. The brutality in occupied territories was, in part, a consequence of operational weakness. An organization that can't gather intelligence efficiently tends to compensate by applying interrogation methods more aggressively, hoping to extract through direct pressure what surveillance would have provided more reliably over time. The postscript to the Lyon operations is documented, though its full implications didn't emerge publicly for decades. Klaus Barbie was not captured at the war's end. He was recruited by United States Army Counterintelligence Corps as an anti-communist intelligence asset in 1947, given false identity documentation, and assisted in escaping to Bolivia in 1951 through a network that included Vatican-affiliated escape route facilitators. He lived in Bolivia under an assumed name until 1983, when he was extradited to France. His conviction for crimes against humanity came in 1987. Between his last documented Gestapo operational command in Lyon and his conviction in a French court, 44 years passed. The files containing the evidence of his activities in Lyon survived him by more than 4 decades. Paper, again, proved more durable than institutional memory or political will. Chapter 11. Wannsee, the Gestapo's final destination. The 20th of January, 1942. A Tuesday, shortly after noon. At a villa on the shores of the Wannsee Lake in the southwestern suburbs of Berlin, 15 senior officials of the Reich take their seats around a conference table. The room is well appointed. The villa had been used before for SS recreational purposes. The table probably holds water, and later, as surviving testimony indicates, cognac. The meeting is chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, who has convened it specifically to coordinate the administrative machinery of what the agenda describes as the final solution of the European Jewish question. The meeting will last approximately 90 minutes. The minutes were typed afterward, produced in 30 copies, distributed to the relevant ministries and offices, and classified at the highest level of secrecy. 29 of those 30 copies were subsequently destroyed. The 30th survived the war in a Foreign Office filing cabinet where it had been misfiled, found not in the Gestapo's own records, which had been burned, but among diplomatic papers recovered by Allied investigators in 1947. The document that described the coordination of the murder of 11 million people survived by being in the wrong drawer. Before examining the conference itself, it's necessary to establish what was already happening by the time the officials sat down at Wannsee on that January afternoon. The Einsatzgruppen had been operating in the occupied Soviet Union since June of 1941, and by the time of the Wannsee Conference had killed an estimated 500,000 to 700,000 Jewish people through mass shooting operations in locations across occupied Soviet territory. The killing of Jewish people had been underway at an industrial scale for 7 months before the conference was convened. Wannsee was therefore not the meeting where the decision to murder European Jews was made. Historians, including Christopher Browning and Peter Longerich, have been clear on this point, and I think it matters enough to state directly. The conference did not initiate the genocide. It coordinated it. The distinction is significant. It means that Wannsee was the moment when the Gestapo's administrative machinery was formally assigned the central coordination function for a process that was already operational, the moment when logistics met scale. The Wannsee Protocol itself, available in full translation through the Holocaust Documentation Archives and introduced as evidence at the Nuremberg trials, identifies its minute secretary in the header, SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, head of Referat 4B4 of the Gestapo. That specific designation, head of the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs Office, is important. Eichmann was not a policy architect at the level of Heydrich or Himmler. He was a logistics administrator. His office's function was coordination, managing the interface between the different national and regional authorities responsible for identifying and assembling Jewish populations for deportation, and the transportation and camp systems that receive them. The Wannsee Conference, from Eichmann's functional perspective, was essentially a coordination meeting, establishing which ministries were responsible for which populations, resolving jurisdictional ambiguities, aligning the administrative machinery of multiple government departments around a unified operational timeline. The protocol lists, in a formatted table, the Jewish population of every European country, including those not yet under German control, together with the total figure that the conference was convening to address, 11 million people. 11 million presented in a table, in a typed document, on standard government paper. Hannah Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil, developed from her coverage of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, is sometimes misunderstood as a claim that the evil was ordinary or that it requires no special explanation. What she was describing, more precisely, was the bureaucratic surface through which the evil expressed itself. The typed tables, the interministerial coordination, the administrative categories, the filing protocols. The document that sat in the wrong Foreign Office filing cabinet for 5 years after the war looks, in its physical format, like a meeting summary from any government administration. The content is the genocide of a continent. The form is indistinguishable from a civil service memo. Eichmann's specific operational role after Wannsee deserves close attention because it illustrates the Gestapo's function within the broader machinery of the final solution with a precision that more general accounts tend to obscure. His Referat 4B4 coordinated deportation logistics by managing the interface between sending authorities, the Gestapo offices in each occupied or satellite country responsible for identifying and assembling Jewish populations, and the transportation infrastructure, primarily the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the Reich railway system. Each deportation transport required a formal Sondertransport request to the Reichsbahn scheduling department. The Reichsbahn charged a standard group rate, half the normal one-way third-class fare for groups of 400 or more, with children under 4 years of age traveling without charge. The Gestapo paid the transport fares using funds confiscated from Jewish community organizations. The Reichsbahn issued itemized receipts. Those receipts were filed. Some of them survived the war in the German Federal Railway Archive and were introduced as evidence at Nuremberg. They are, in every formal respect, transportation invoices. What they invoiced is what they invoiced. The single most intensive application of this machinery occurred in 1944 in Hungary. Following the German occupation of Hungary in March of 1944, Eichmann personally deployed to Budapest with a team of approximately 150 Gestapo officers. Working in coordination with Hungarian authorities and using the Gestapo's standard operational protocols, lists from existing records, coordinated with local police, transport requests to the Reichsbahn. His team organized the deportation of 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 56 days, between the 15th of May and the 9th of July, 1944. This is the highest concentration of deportations in the operational history of the final solution. An average of approximately 7,800 people deported per day for 56 consecutive days. The logistics required were, from an administrative standpoint, an extreme test of the coordination system that Eichmann's office had been building since the Wannsee Conference. By all operational measures, the system worked. There is a historiographical debate about Eichmann's nature that I want to address directly, because it has genuine implications for how we understand the Gestapo's broader personnel. Hannah Arendt's characterization of Eichmann at his Jerusalem trial as a fundamentally thoughtless bureaucrat, a man who failed to think morally rather than a man who thought and chose evil, was challenged significantly by Bettina Stangnitz research, published in English as Eichmann Before Jerusalem in 2014. Stangnitz worked with recorded conversations from Eichmann's years in Argentina after the war, conversations in which he spoke with a candor unavailable at his Jerusalem trial, and found a man who spoke with genuine enthusiasm about the operations he had conducted, and genuine commitment to the ideology that had framed them. Whether the Arendt portrait or the Stangnitz portrait is closer to the truth of Eichmann's inner life is a question the documentary evidence doesn't fully settle. They may both be partially accurate, describing the same man in different contexts and emotional registers. What the debate establishes is that the question of what the Gestapo's functionaries actually believed, as opposed to what they said they believed when their lives depended on the answer, is not resolved, and probably cannot be fully resolved. The surviving protocol is numbered as copy 16 of 30. Copies 1 through 15 and 17 through 30 were destroyed. Copy 16 survived in the wrong filing cabinet. When Allied investigators found it in 1947, they initially treated it with some suspicion. A document of this significance, surviving when all the others were gone, required verification. That verification was established through cross-referencing with other documentary evidence. The meeting's attendees could be confirmed from other sources. The organizations represented aligned with what was known about the administrative structure of the final solution. The language and terminology matched other RSHA documents of the period. Copy 16 was genuine. It had survived because it had been misfiled. The person who misfiled it, an unnamed Foreign Office clerk who placed it in the wrong location sometime in 1942 or 1943, made a filing error that may constitute the most historically significant administrative mistake in the 20th century. I find myself returning, in thinking about Wannsee, to the table in the protocol that lists the Jewish population of each European country. It is the most precisely formatted and most grotesque administrative document I have worked with in any research context. The table lists countries, populations, and then subtotals. It has column headers. It is formatted with the care that a civil servant brings to a document intended for ministerial distribution. The people in those columns, 11 million of them, are reduced, in the table's logic, to administrative quantities, inputs to a coordination problem requiring logistical resolution. Every number in that table represents a human life. The document treats them as data points. The Gestapo's central administrative function, from the founding decree of April 1933 to the Wannsee coordination meeting of January 1942, was the progressive transformation of human lives into administrative categories. The table in the protocol is where that transformation reached its terminal expression. Chapter 12. The White Rose. What resistance actually looked like. The 18th of February, 1943. A Thursday morning. The University of Munich. The lecture halls are between sessions, and the stone corridors are quiet, in the way that institutional buildings go quiet between their scheduled uses. A specific, particular silence, different from nighttime emptiness, threaded through with the distant sounds of a functioning building. On an upper floor, two figures move along a corridor. They carry a suitcase. The suitcase contains leaflets. The sixth leaflet, produced by the group that called itself the White Rose, printed the previous night in a small run on a duplicating machine, folded and stacked and now being distributed along the empty corridors. The leaflets are placed at intervals outside closed lecture hall doors, left where students will find them when the doors open. Then, at the top of a stairwell, something happens. The historical accounts differ slightly in their physical details, but a stack of leaflets falls, or is pushed, from a balcony railing. They flutter down into the atrium below. A university custodian named Jacob Schmidt sees them fall. He sees who pushed them. He moves toward them. The Gestapo file on the White Rose was opened, in operational terms, at approximately 3:45 in the afternoon of the 18th of February, 1943, when two students, Hans and Sophie Scholl, were brought to the Munich Gestapo office under detention. The intake form completed that afternoon began with the standard header: name, date of birth, occupation. Below that, the interrogating officer's first recorded question, and then Sophie Scholl's recorded answer. The answer was yes. She confirmed that she knew what she was doing constituted an act against the state. The interrogation transcript that follows runs to 22 pages. It is factual, professionally written, and, in the specific way that documents produced under institutionalized coercion can be, accurate in its surface content while being entirely silent about the human conditions under which it was produced. What I want to establish before anything else about the White Rose case is the Gestapo's operational position relative to the group before the 18th of February. Because the institutional reality of this case is something that the popular narrative, focused appropriately on the courage of the people involved, tends to underemphasize. The Munich Gestapo office had no file on the White Rose during the 8 months between the first leaflet's distribution in June of 1942 and the arrests in February of 1943. None. The group produced and distributed an estimated 15,000 copies of 6 separate leaflets across Munich, and, in later phases, to other cities, using postal distribution as well as hand placement. They operated in the city where the Gestapo had substantial regional presence and institutional resources. And for 8 months they were, from the Gestapo's perspective, organizationally invisible. The post-war internal assessment of the Munich Gestapo's pre-arrest intelligence on the White Rose establishes this absence in fairly stark terms. They weren't found by surveillance. They were caught by chance. The specific counter-surveillance methods the White Rose used are worth understanding because they represent a thoughtful operational security approach assembled without any professional intelligence training. The group avoided telephone communication for organizational matters. Different typewriters were used for different leaflets, confirmed by post-war forensic analysis of the surviving printed copies, which shows distinct typeface differences between individual leaflet runs. Paper and supplies were obtained from multiple sources and across state lines to avoid creating concentrated purchase records that might attract attention. The distribution of leaflets by post, rather than exclusively by hand, was designed to create geographic uncertainty about the group's location. The Gestapo, analyzing the leaflets that came to their attention through citizen reports over the 8 months of distribution, correctly identified Munich as the probable origin city, but was unable to narrow further without a direct tip. The group's operational security wasn't perfect. The geographic concentration around the university was a fundamental vulnerability, but it was coherent, and it worked for 8 months against a surveillance apparatus that the popular imagination has typically treated as omnipresent. The arrest itself was, from the Gestapo's operational standpoint, an institutional embarrassment that the post-arrest paperwork works quite hard to obscure. The group was not identified through Gestapo surveillance or informant reporting. They were not caught because a V-man had infiltrated their network, or because a postal monitoring officer had flagged a pattern of suspicious mailings. They were caught because a university custodian saw a stack of leaflets fall from a balcony railing, recognized the students who had dropped them, and physically detained them until the Gestapo arrived. Jakob Schmidt was not a Gestapo employee, not an SS member, and not, by the available evidence, a particularly ideologically committed Nazi. He was a custodian who saw something he considered a rule violation in a building he was responsible for, and took action to enforce the rules. The post-war accounts of his motivation vary. Some emphasize ideological commitment. Others suggest institutional loyalty and conflict with students he found disruptive. The historical record doesn't settle this with certainty. What it establishes is that the Gestapo's most publicly significant domestic arrest of the war's middle period was made not by the Gestapo, but by a university custodian acting on personal initiative. Once the arrests were made, the Gestapo moved with a speed that stands in notable contrast to the 8 months of prior invisibility. The Scholl siblings and their immediate colleagues were interrogated within hours of arrest. The interrogation methodology shifted from the standard slow accumulation of file-based intelligence, building a case over weeks from cross-reference sources, to an urgency-driven direct extraction approach, working outward from the arrested individuals to identify every contact, every collaborator, every person who had known what they were doing. The pressure from Berlin was significant. The Nazi leadership wanted a public show trial as quickly as possible, partly to demonstrate the consequences of resistance, and partly to contain the political embarrassment of students at a German university distributing anti-regime literature for the better part of a year without detection. Within 4 days of the initial arrest, Hans and Sophie Scholl and their fellow member Christoph Probst had been tried before the People's Court under the presiding judge Roland Freisler, convicted and executed. The time from arrest to execution was 4 days. The People's Court proceedings on the 22nd of February, 1943, were not a judicial process in any meaningful sense. Freisler's conduct during the trial, shouting at defendants, repeatedly interrupting their statements, conducting what surviving accounts describe as a performance of institutional rage rather than a legal examination, was partly temperamental and partly strategic. The Gestapo's role in the trial proceedings was the management of prisoner presentation, ensuring the defendants arrived in the condition and appearance that served the desired institutional message. This included, in the People's Court proceedings against the July 1944 plotters, which we'll examine in the next chapter, deliberate choices about clothing and physical presentation designed to humiliate. For the February 1943 trials, the proceedings were conducted with somewhat less theatrical elaboration, but the outcome was the same: predetermined conviction, same-day execution. When I look at the Gestapo's internal post-arrest assessment of the White Rose case, the document produced in March of 1943 reviewing how the group had operated and recommending changes to surveillance protocols, what strikes me most is what it focuses on and what it ignores. The report concentrates almost entirely on the postal distribution method, recommending enhanced monitoring of university postal facilities and increased attention to irregular mailing patterns from student populations. It does not address the 8 months during which the group operated without Gestapo awareness. It does not examine why the infiltration of Munich University student networks, the kind of informant development that the Gestapo had successfully conducted in political and trade union circles in the 1930s, had apparently not been applied to the university environment. The institutional blind spot is not acknowledged. The operational failure that the case represents, the organization's inability to detect an active resistance group operating in its home city for 8 months, is processed into a set of targeted procedural recommendations about postal monitoring and then filed. The final operational detail of this case sits at the intersection of institutional behavior and individual choice in a way that resists easy framing. Jakob Schmid, the custodian, received an award for his actions, a cash payment, and a formal commendation from the regime. He was not prosecuted after the war for his role in the events of the 18th of February, 1943. The denazification framework that processed former Gestapo officers and SS members had no category for the civilian non-member who had made a single choice on a staircase. The system had no mechanism for that kind of accountability, because it had no mechanism for acknowledging the broader civilian participation that the Würzburg files and the November pogrom arrest operations, and now the Munich custodian's choice, all point toward in their different registers. The Gestapo, at its operational base, was not a self-contained institution. It was an institution embedded in a society that was, in various degrees and for various reasons, partly complicit in its functioning. The White Rose case makes that embedding visible in the most direct possible way. The most effective secret police apparatus in the world was defeated, in its home city, by a small group of students for 8 months. Then it was betrayed by a man with a broom. The files on Hans and Sophie Scholl and the White Rose members were closed within days of the executions. The cards were updated. The cross-references were added. The cases were marked resolved. In the filing room on the second floor, the drawers slid shut. Outside, February light lay across the Munich streets. Somewhere, a duplicating machine sat in a room that would soon be searched and cleared. The text of the 6th leaflet had been smuggled out of Germany by a German military officer who opposed the regime and transmitted to Britain, where the Royal Air Force printed millions of copies and dropped them over Germany from aircraft. The words that the Gestapo had tried to contain fell from the sky over German cities for months afterward. Paper again. Always paper. Chapter 13. The July Plot. The Gestapo hunts its own army. The 20th of July, 1944, 12:42 in the afternoon. At the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's forward command headquarters in the forests of East Prussia, a briefcase sits beneath a heavy oak map table in a conference room. The briefcase contains a bomb. The room contains approximately 24 officers and staff gathered for a routine military situation conference. Outside, it is warm. The windows of the wooden conference barracks are open to let in the summer air, a detail that would prove operationally significant in ways nobody in that room had yet calculated. At 12:42, the bomb detonates. The room fills with smoke and debris. 4 men are killed. Adolf Hitler, standing at the far end of the table, survives with burst eardrums, singed hair, and injuries to his right arm. Within minutes, he is on the telephone to Berlin. Within the hour, Himmler is receiving orders. And in Gestapo offices across the Reich, the teletype machines are beginning to print the opening instructions of what will become the largest single criminal investigation in the organization's 12-year history. What I find operationally remarkable about the Gestapo's response to the 20th of July, when I work through the reconstructed timeline in the scholarship, is the speed at which it shifted from confusion to systematic pursuit. The first hours after the bomb were genuinely chaotic. Competing orders from different command authorities, uncertainty about Hitler's survival, the half-executed Operation Valkyrie orders creating a brief, strange interregnum in which the conspirators had partially activated the Reserve Army's emergency protocols before the failure of the assassination became clear. In Paris, the conspirators actually managed to disarm and temporarily detain the local SS and Gestapo leadership for several hours before the news from East Prussia reversed the balance. That moment in Paris, where the Gestapo was briefly, physically overpowered by a military operation it hadn't anticipated, is one of the more striking details in the operational record of the plot. It didn't last. By evening, the situation had reversed completely. But the Paris interlude reveals something about the plot's potential that the failure in East Prussia tends to obscure. The Gestapo's investigative breakthrough came not from surveillance that had predated the plot, but from the physical evidence recovered at the Bindler Block, the Wehrmacht headquarters building in Berlin where the coup attempt had its administrative center. When Gestapo investigators arrived at the Bindler Block on the morning of the 21st of July, the 4 principal military leaders of the conspiracy had already been shot in the courtyard the previous night, on the authority of General Friedrich Fromm, who had participated peripherally in the conspiracy and moved with lethal speed to eliminate the most direct witnesses to his own involvement. The Gestapo arrived to find the men they most needed to interrogate already dead. What they found instead was paper, documents and filing cabinets, some partially burned but not fully destroyed. Correspondence showing connections to networks that spread far beyond the immediate circle of military conspirators. The investigation unfolded from those documents outward, in concentric rings, expanding week by week as each name extracted under interrogation produced new names. Each new name produced new connections, and the Gestapo's card index absorbed the expanding conspiracy map with the methodical efficiency that was the organization's most consistent operational characteristic. The scale of what followed requires specific numbers to be properly understood. Between the 20th of July and the end of October 1944, the Gestapo arrested more than 7,000 individuals. Of those, approximately 4,980 were executed, a figure cited in multiple post-war assessments, though the precise number, given the document destruction of the final months, is almost certainly an estimate rather than a confirmed total. The mathematical relationship between those figures is stark. Roughly 200 of the 7,000 arrested were specifically identified as active participants in the July plot itself. The remaining 6,800 were people connected to the conspirators by varying degrees of proximity. Some who had known about the plot and said nothing. Some who had participated in peripheral discussions. Some who had expressed private sympathy with resistance ideas, and some whose connection to the conspiracy was tenuous enough that the Gestapo's own case notes acknowledge uncertainty about their actual involvement. The investigation had begun as a pursuit of a specific conspiracy. Within weeks, it had become something broader, a general suppression of any person in any position who had demonstrated the capacity for independent judgment about the regime's conduct. The specific interrogation methodology deployed in the post-plot investigations differed from the Gestapo's standard operating procedure in one important respect. Normal Gestapo investigations, as we've established across earlier chapters, proceeded at the pace of the filing system, accumulating evidence, cross-referencing files, building cases over days or weeks. The post-July 20th investigations operated under direct and urgent pressure from Hitler and Himmler to produce results quickly, and this pressure produced a more aggressive and less methodical interrogation approach than the organization normally employed. The interrogation logs from this period, where they survive, show a frequency of sessions and an immediacy of demands for information that differ noticeably from the procedural pacing of the pre-1944 case files. The institutional need for speed compromised the institutional commitment to procedure. This produced faster initial results and, almost certainly, a higher rate of false confessions and unreliable identifications, names given under extreme pressure that expanded the arrest wave into regions of the German population only tangentially connected to any actual conspiracy. The Sippenhaft doctrine, collective family punishment, was applied after the July plot with a systematic thoroughness it had never previously achieved, on explicit orders that can be traced to Hitler himself and that moved through the institutional chain via Himmler and the Gestapo. The families of identified conspirators were arrested. Wives, parents, siblings, children. Their assets were confiscated. Their children were removed from family custody and placed in SS-managed care under changed names, a procedure that required the creation of new administrative file categories, coordination with SS welfare offices, and the maintenance of a parallel record system tracking children separated from their families. Several of these children spent years after the war not knowing their own names or the fate of their parents. The last formally documented case of a child successfully reconnected to their biological family history through post-war archival research was resolved only in 1997. The Gestapo's paperwork, in this specific instance, outlasted the people it had processed by more than 5 decades. The People's Court show trials that followed the arrests were, as I mentioned in the outline for this project, partly a Gestapo staging production. The decision about how defendants were to appear before Judge Roland Freisler, in ill-fitting civilian clothes, without belts or braces, required to hold up their own trousers throughout the proceedings, was documented as a deliberate institutional choice, not an incidental humiliation. Hitler reportedly ordered the proceedings to be filmed. The Gestapo managed prisoner transport and presentation. The films exist, or substantial portions of them do. They've been reviewed by historians, and some footage is available in documentary archives. Watching them is, in its specific way, one of the more revealing things you can do with the visual record of this period. because what you see in those films is not simply legal proceedings. What you see is the Gestapo performing institutional dominance for the camera, translating the physical power of arrest and detention into a public demonstration of consequences. The terror, by 1944, was being staged as well as enacted. There is a historiographical question about Himmler's conduct in the days immediately after the 20th of July that I want to note without overstating. Some scholarship, including analysis by historian Felix Romer, has suggested that Himmler's rapid and public demonstrations of loyalty to Hitler in the plot's immediate aftermath were partly designed to eliminate any record of a brief period in which he may have calculated whether a changed political situation might offer him personal opportunities. No direct documentary evidence of such a calculation has been found. The circumstantial case rests on Himmler's known ambitions and on certain anomalies in the timing of his communications in the hours after the bomb. I flag this not as established fact, but as an example of the kind of interpretive question that the historical record raises without fully answering. A reminder that even the Gestapo's own leadership operated within a web of political calculation that the official documents only partially reveal. By the autumn of 1944, the post-plot investigation had effectively dismantled the organized German military resistance. The Abwehr, military intelligence, which had served as a partial institutional shelter for resistance-connected figures under Admiral Canaris, was dissolved and absorbed into the RSHA, eliminating one of the last institutional spaces within the German state where a degree of independent judgment had occasionally been possible. The July plot had been, in military terms, a failure. In Gestapo terms, it had been an operational windfall. The investigation it triggered gave the organization both the mandate and the intelligence yield to pursue resistance networks that had existed for years beyond its previous reach. 7,000 arrests. The Army, the Foreign Office, the Abwehr, the churches, civilian professional networks, all penetrated, all filed, all cross-referenced in the ever-expanding card index. The machinery had eaten the last organized opposition within the German state. What remained was the final year, and in the final year, the machinery would increasingly turn inward. Chapter 14. The Last Year. Terror at Home, Collapse Abroad. November 1944. The Gestapo Regional Office for Cologne. The building has taken bomb damage. The roof over the eastern wing is partially open to the sky, covered with tarpaulin that lifts and settles in the wind. The standard printed letterhead has run out. The office is using blank civilian paper, stamping the Gestapo heading by hand with an ink stamp that leaves a slightly uneven impression because the rubber is beginning to deteriorate. A memo typed on this improvised stationery reports that the central filing room has been partially destroyed by a nearby blast and requests guidance from Berlin on whether duplicate records should be reconstructed from memory and secondary sources. The reply from Berlin, stamped the 30th of November, is brief. Reconstruction not required. Continue current operations. The files are gone. The instructions are to continue as though they aren't. Downstairs, an arrest report from that same week is being typed on the same blank paper with the same hand-stamped heading. The operations continue. The final year of the Gestapo's operational existence is characterized by a paradox that runs through the administrative record, wherever it survives. The organization was simultaneously more murderous and less functional than at any previous point in its history. The Allied advance in the West following the Normandy landings, the Soviet advance from the East, and the sustained Allied strategic bombing campaign were progressively destroying the physical infrastructure that the Gestapo's communications and administrative systems depended upon. Regional offices relocated to improvised premises. Teletype connections to Berlin became intermittent and then unreliable. The central card index system in Berlin was being moved in sections to dispersed locations to protect it from bombing, a logistical exercise that compromised the cross-referencing function that was the system's core operational value. The master database of the terror state was being packed into boxes and loaded onto trucks and driven to storage locations that were themselves subject to the disruptions of a collapsing war economy. And yet the arrest rate was accelerating. Between the 1st of January and the 8th of May, 1945, the Gestapo processed an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 arrest files across Germany. More in 4 months of organizational disintegration than in the entire year of 1936, when the organization was running at full institutional capacity with intact communications, functioning files, and a stable social context. This acceleration in the face of collapse is not, when you examine the operational record, as paradoxical as it initially appears. The categories of offense that were generating the highest arrest rates in the final year were largely new ones, or ones that had existed on paper but had rarely been prosecuted at scale. Desertion, defeatism, undermining military morale, listening to foreign radio broadcasts, expressing pessimism about the war's outcome. These were offenses defined by words and attitudes rather than organizational membership, and they required no extensive prior file building to prosecute. A civilian overheard making a pessimistic remark about the war could be arrested on a neighbor's report within hours. The filing was minimal. The consequences were lethal. The specific legal mechanism driving the acceleration was the Wehrkraftzersetzung statute, the undermining of military morale, which had existed since 1939, but whose enforcement in the final year of the war became dramatically more aggressive. Under this statute, expressing doubt about Germany's ultimate victory, making defeatist statements in public, or assisting deserters from the military were capital offenses. The Gestapo was responsible for investigation and referral. The Standgerichte, emergency drumhead courts-martial established in the final months of the war, handled sentencing, sometimes completing a case in under an hour. The separation between investigation and execution that had at least nominally existed in the organization's earlier procedure had, by the spring of 1945, effectively collapsed. The time between denunciation and death was, in some documented cases, measured in days. In a few extreme instances, in hours. The estimate of German soldiers executed for desertion-related offenses in the war's final year sits, depending on the source, between 5,000 and 15,000. The scholarship of Manfred Messerschmitt and Fritz Wüllner on the Wehrmacht's internal judicial system, cross-referenced with Gestapo operational records from the period, suggests a figure toward the higher end of that range is more defensible than the lower. But the document destruction of the final months makes precise enumeration impossible, and I want to be careful not to present a specific number as established when the scholarly consensus acknowledges a range. What is not in dispute is the qualitative character of the enforcement. It was widespread, rapid, and increasingly untethered from any evidentiary standard that would have been recognizable as a legal process, even by the Gestapo's own earlier institutional norms. The advance of Allied and Soviet forces created a secondary operational imperative that ran alongside the arrest acceleration: the systematic destruction of records. This was not a spontaneous or panicked response. It was an organized institutional action, planned in advance and executed with varying degrees of completeness as different regions fell. Gestapo offices in the West began destroying or removing files months before Allied forces arrived, following standing orders to prevent operational records from falling into enemy hands. The destruction was targeted. Some categories of records were burned first, others were evacuated, others were left. The pattern of what was destroyed and what survived reflects deliberate institutional choices about which records posed the greatest evidential liability. Files documenting the deportation of Jewish residents were among those most systematically destroyed. The surviving archives we examined in earlier chapters, the Düsseldorf cards, the Würzburg files, the Bergen records, represent the gaps and inconsistencies in this destruction, rather than a representative sample of what existed. In several German cities, the process of destroying records created a specific operational irony that the post-war investigators noted in their reports. The Gestapo officers who burned their files frequently used their V-Männer, their informant networks, to arrange false documentation and escape routes before the Allied advance reached them. The informants whose identities had been protected in those files were, in some cases, the same people who helped the officers who had run them to disappear. The destruction of the files protected both parties simultaneously. The officer, who could have been identified from his own operational records, and the informants whose names the records contained. The machinery of mutual protection that had sustained the surveillance apparatus was turned, in its final operational phase, to the protection of the people who had operated it. The executions of Admiral Canaris, General Hans Oster, Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and others at Flossenburg concentration camp on the 9th of April, 1945, sit in the documentary record as the clearest single example of what historians have termed the final killings, the execution of significant prisoners in advance of camp liberation, simultaneously eliminating witnesses and destroying evidence. The Flossenburg execution records survived, a piece of documentary contingency that allowed the specific circumstances to be reconstructed after the war. 16 days after those executions, Allied forces liberated the camp. The margin between the killings and the liberation was just over 2 weeks. Whether that margin was calculated, whether the executions were timed with awareness of the Allied advance, is a question the surviving records suggest but don't definitively answer. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo's operational chief since 1939, the man who had signed the 1155 teletype on the 9th of November 1938, who had coordinated the Final Solutions administrative machinery, who had overseen the post-July plot investigation, was last reliably documented in the Führer bunker in Berlin on the 28th or 29th of April 1945. After that date, the record goes silent. He was not captured. He was not confirmed killed. He was not found among the dead identified in the bunker complex or in the immediate Berlin area. A set of remains buried under his name in a Berlin grave was examined in a DNA analysis conducted in 2013, which established definitively that the skeleton was not Müller. He had not died there. Where he went, whether to the Soviet Union, as some CIA assessments speculated, whether to South America, as others suggested, whether he died anonymously in the ruins of Berlin by some undocumented means, remains, as of the most current archival research, genuinely unresolved. The most senior surviving operational chief of the secret police apparatus that had administered the persecution of millions was never found, and the case has never been formally closed. The last administrative act of the Gestapo as a functioning institution is difficult to identify precisely, because the institution didn't end at a specific moment. It dissolved, offices going dark one by one as the Allied and Soviet advances made their continued operation impossible, personnel dispersing into the civilian population with false papers or genuine ones, the files going into incinerators or into the hands of incoming Allied investigators, the card index drawers emptied into boxes or into fires, depending on who was there and what orders they'd received and how much time remained. The machine didn't stop. It ran until the fuel was gone, and then the parts separated. And the parts went different ways, and some of them were found, and some of them weren't. The ventilation in the filing rooms fell silent. The carbon paper smell dissipated. The drawers were empty or burning. And outside, in the May air of a defeated country, 12 years of institutional history was beginning the long process of becoming something that could be examined, argued about, and never fully accounted for. Chapter 15. Nuremberg. Putting a ghost on trial. The 29th of August, 1946. Courtroom 600 of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. The International Military Tribunal is into its 10th month of proceedings. The afternoon session is occupied with closing arguments on the question of criminal organizations. The prosecution's attempt to have the court declare certain Nazi institutions, as institutions, guilty of criminal conduct, a legal innovation that had no precise precedent in international law, and whose implications the tribunal's four-nation judicial panel was still actively debating. Robert Jackson, the United States chief prosecutor, is making his argument about the Gestapo. The relevant passage of his submission has been preserved in the trial record. He tells the court that there could be no secrecy about the criminal aims of the Gestapo or the criminal methods by which it operated, that its name had become a symbol of terror throughout the world, that there was no basis for exempting any of its members from responsibility. Then the tribunal notes the submitted evidence. Among the documents introduced in support of the prosecution's position is a card index file from Düsseldorf, the same regional filing system we examined in Chapter 4, now serving as prosecution evidence in the most significant international criminal proceeding in history. The card that was a tool of persecution has become its own witness. The legal innovation at Nuremberg of prosecuting an organization rather than solely individuals was a response to a practical problem that the scale of the Nazi state had created. The Gestapo, at its wartime peak, had approximately 32,000 full-time officers. The RSHA as a whole had employed vastly more. The SD's informant network numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The individual prosecution of each person who had participated in the apparatus was not logistically possible in any reasonable time frame, and there was a genuine legal question about whether the standard prosecution framework, which required demonstrating individual criminal acts by named defendants, was capable of capturing the institutional character of what had occurred. The organizational criminality approach was the tribunal's attempt to address this. If the Gestapo, as an organization, could be declared criminal, then member states could use that declaration as a foundation for prosecuting individual members in national courts without having to rebuild the entire evidentiary case from scratch for each defendant. The defense presented for the Gestapo organization was handled by Dr. Rudolf Merkel, a German lawyer appointed by the tribunal for the purpose. His argument was structurally coherent, even if the tribunal ultimately rejected it. He submitted that the majority of Gestapo personnel were civil servants performing administrative functions, filing, processing, communicating, who had no direct involvement in, and in many cases no knowledge of, the organization's worst operational activities. He introduced affidavits from several hundred Gestapo clerks and administrative staff, attesting to the routine bureaucratic character of their work. The tribunal acknowledged this argument in its judgment. It then qualified the criminal organization finding to exclude persons who had been drafted into the organization involuntarily and who had no knowledge of its criminal purposes. This exclusion clause, which sounded reasonable as a statement of legal principle, created an immediate and practically devastating implementation problem. Because how much knowledge of what specific criminal activities constituted knowledge of criminal purposes? Was a regional filing clerk who typed deportation orders aware of what the deportations led to? Was an administrative secretary who processed Schutzhaft paperwork aware that the detentions were extrajudicial? The tribunal's judgment created the principle and left the definition of its scope open enough that national courts were subsequently able to apply it very narrowly indeed. The verdicts on October 1, 1946, declared the Gestapo a criminal organization along with the SS, the SD, and the leadership corps of the NSDAP. 12 individual defendants received death sentences. 3 received life imprisonment. 3 were acquitted. The announcement of the organizational verdicts was followed, in the months and years after Nuremberg, by the establishment of German denunciation courts, Spruchkammern, empowered to prosecute individual former Gestapo members for specific crimes on the basis of the tribunal's organizational criminality finding. The results of this process are documented, and the documentation is, if you spend time with it, genuinely difficult to sit with. Of the estimated 32,000 individuals who had served as full-time Gestapo officers at some point between 1933 and 1945, the number who served actual prison sentences specifically for Gestapo-related crimes in the decade following the war was approximately 180 to 200, less than 1%. The criminal organization verdict was legally historic. As a mechanism for achieving accountability, it was close to inoperative. The specific reasons for this gap between legal principle and practical outcome are documented in the records of the denazification proceedings and in subsequent assessments by German legal historians. The denazification courts were overwhelmed. They faced hundreds of thousands of cases across all categories of Nazi party and organization membership, with inadequate staffing and resources. The "I didn't know" defense was accepted by the courts with a consistency that the evidentiary record, given what we know about the Gestapo's internal communications, its all-staff directives, its openly published legal framework, does not straightforwardly support. The destruction of Gestapo files in the final months of the war meant that prosecutors often couldn't demonstrate specific criminal acts by specific individuals, even when the institutional record made general criminal participation clear. The legal burden of proof in individual criminal cases required specificity that the surviving records frequently couldn't supply. And the courts were operating in a society where former Gestapo members were deeply embedded in local communities, often providing mutual Passierscheine, character references, that created self-reinforcing networks of exoneration. Werner Best is the case I keep returning to when I think about the gap between what the Nuremberg framework promised and what the post-war accountability process delivered. Best was not a peripheral figure. He was the Gestapo's chief legal officer. He designed the Schutzhaft bureaucratic architecture. He wrote the legal framework that exempted the Gestapo from judicial review. He drafted significant portions of the Gestapo law of 1936. He was, in a meaningful sense, the intellectual architect of the legal structure that made the Gestapo what it was. After the war, he was convicted, but by a Danish court, for his conduct as Reich Commissioner of Denmark, not for his Gestapo work. He was sentenced to death, which was commuted and then pardoned in 1951. He returned to West Germany. He spent the decades between the 1950s and 1980s working as a legal consultant to conservative political organizations, occasionally writing on historical topics, and living in ordinary civilian circumstances. He died in West Germany in 1989. For his work in designing the Gestapo's legal framework, the foundational institutional contribution that enabled everything we have examined across 14 chapters of this documentary, he was never prosecuted. When I was cross-referencing the Nuremberg prosecution briefs with the post-war denazification records, the detail that stayed with me longest was not any specific case outcome, but the physical character of the denazification files themselves. They used the same pre-printed forms, the same categorical structure, the same filing conventions as the Gestapo documents they were ostensibly prosecuting. The bureaucratic DNA of the institutional form, the intake form, the category field, the source of report, the recommended action, persisted into the accountability process. The machinery of documentation that had administered the persecution was the same machinery, in its structural essentials, that administered the accounting for it. There's something in that continuity that I find difficult to articulate cleanly. It suggests that the problem wasn't the bureaucracy. It was the purposes to which the bureaucracy was directed. And that's a harder problem, because purposes are not visible in filing conventions. The Nuremberg Tribunal's organizational criminality finding created a legal framework that subsequent international criminal law developed into the doctrine of joint criminal enterprise, applied at the international criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and incorporated into the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. In this sense, the tribunal's innovation was genuinely consequential for the architecture of international justice. The Gestapo verdict's procedural legacy is measurable in the subsequent development of international law. Its practical legacy, in terms of accountability for the specific individuals who had staffed and operated the organization, is, in the evidentiary record, considerably less impressive. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. The tribunal did something unprecedented and important. It also failed, in its practical application, to hold accountable the overwhelming majority of the people who had operated the most extensively documented criminal organization in the history of the modern state. The cards in the Düsseldorf filing drawers had survived the war. Most of the people who had maintained them survived the peace. Chapter 16. The Gray Network. Gestapo officers in the New Germany. 1952. A a provincial city in the western half of a divided Germany. A denazification court file has been stamped abgeschlossen, closed. The subject's former occupation is recorded as Gestapo Kommissar, regional assignment, 1938 to 1944. Current occupation, insurance claims adjuster. No evidence of specific criminal acts was established in the proceedings. The case is closed. Somewhere in the city, the man goes to work on a Monday morning. He fills out forms. He processes claims. He is, from the perspective of every official document that now governs his existence, a citizen in good standing, his prior occupation a matter of closed record in a filing cabinet that is not accessible to his colleagues, his neighbors, or the people whose insurance claims he reviews. The filing cabinet that contains his Gestapo career sits in the same building as the filing cabinet that contains his new one. The drawers look the same. The paper smells the same. The stamps are different. The absorption of former Gestapo and associated security apparatus personnel into the West German state, the intelligence services, the legal profession, and private industry in the 1940s and 50s was not a secret, exactly, but it was not publicly acknowledged either. It existed in the space between official knowledge and official statement, something that various senior officials were aware of, something that American occupation authorities had partially facilitated in some cases, and something that the political imperatives of a democratic state building itself in the shadow of the Cold War made awkward to address directly. The Federal Republic needed functioning institutions. Functioning institutions needed experienced administrators. The pool of experienced administrators available in post-war Germany included large numbers of people whose experience had been acquired in the service of the regime those institutions were replacing. The tension between these facts was managed, in most cases, through administrative procedures that produced outcomes convenient for everyone except the victims. The specific mechanism by which former Nazi officials, including those with Gestapo connections, obtained positions in the new West German state has been documented in several important studies that emerged from the archival openings of the 1980s and 90s. The denazification Spruchkammer classifications, main culprit, incriminated, less incriminated, follower, exonerated, were applied with sufficient inconsistency and sufficient responsiveness to character testimony from former colleagues that the classifications became, over time, something closer to administrative paperwork than to genuine assessment. The Passivschein, the colloquial term for the whitewashing character reference, was the critical document. Former Gestapo officers providing such references for each other created a self-sustaining network of mutual exoneration. The Vertrauensmänner system, the trusted man network, applied to the problem of post-war survival rather than to wartime informant management. The operational method was identical. The purposes had been redirected. The case of Hans Globke is the most documented and politically significant example of the personnel continuity problem, though Globke himself was technically a senior Interior Ministry official rather than a Gestapo officer. Between 1933 and 1945, Globke had served in the Reich Interior Ministry and had written the official legal commentaries on the Nuremberg racial laws of 1935, the legal annotations that guided the implementation of the laws that stripped Jewish Germans of citizenship and rights. These commentaries were published documents. They bore his name. Between 1953 and 1963, Hans Globke served as State Secretary in the office of Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the most senior civil service position in the West German federal government, with responsibility for coordinating the Chancellor's office across all departments. This was not a minor clerical role. It was, by most assessments, the most powerful administrative position in the Federal Republic below the Chancellor himself. His presence in that role was known to Adenauer. It was known to the Allied governments that maintained oversight relationships with the Federal Republic. It was the subject of active East German political warfare. The East German government conducted a show trial of Globke in absentia in 1963, sentencing him to life imprisonment in proceedings that were politically motivated but factually grounded. Globke retired in 1963. He was never prosecuted by the Federal Republic. The formation of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the West German Foreign Intelligence Service, under Reinhard Gehlen tells a related story about the structured absorption of former intelligence and security personnel into the Cold War state. Gehlen had served as the Wehrmacht's chief of intelligence on the Eastern Front, and in the immediate post-war period, he negotiated with American authorities the preservation and redeployment of his intelligence networks against the Soviet Union in exchange for American patronage. The Gehlen Organization, which became the BND on its formal establishment in 1956, employed, according to the BND's own internal history released in 2017, significant numbers of former SS and SD officers. The precise number of former Gestapo-connected personnel within the organization remains contested between the BND's own accounting and the estimates of independent researchers. The 2017 internal history acknowledged the presence of former SS members more frankly than previous official statements had done, while still providing figures that some researchers consider minimum estimates. What the 1964 investigation of West German Foreign Office staffing found was not entirely surprising to those who had been tracking the denazification records, but it was significant when it became public. Of 649 senior officials serving in the Foreign Office at that time, 161, approaching 25%, had been members of the Nazi Party, and in many cases had served in offices with direct connections to the SS, SD, or associated organizations. This figure, initially suppressed and subsequently leaked to the German press, produced a political controversy that was resolved primarily by the passage of time rather than by any substantial accountability action. The officials in question had, in most cases, long service records in the Federal Republic by the time the figures became public. Several were close to retirement. The institutional response was to note the issue, pass some time, and allow the demographic solution, the eventual retirement and death of the cohort in question, to remove the problem without directly addressing it. The establishment of the Zentrale Stelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen zur Aufklärung nationalsozialistischer Verbrechen, the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, at Ludwigsburg in 1958 is worth examining as an institutional response to a situation that had become embarrassing. Germany's failure to investigate its own past through the denazification process had become visible enough by the late 1950s to generate political pressure for a more systematic approach. The Central Office was created to coordinate investigation of Nazi crimes across all West German state prosecutorial authorities, developing cases that could then be handed to individual state prosecutors for trial. Since its founding, it has investigated approximately 7,000 cases and achieved convictions in a fraction of those. As of the most recent annual reports available in the scholarship I've been working with, the Central Office continues to operate with a staff of fewer than 30 investigators. To put that in context, the organization investigating 12 years of state-organized mass murder, conducted by an apparatus of tens of thousands of officers and hundreds of thousands of informants and collaborators, employs fewer people than a medium-sized urban police department's specialist fraud unit. What I find most revealing when I work through the scholarship on post-war personnel continuity is not the specific cases of individuals who escaped accountability, though those are significant, but the structural observation about what the continuity meant for institutional memory. The Federal Republic's security and intelligence services in the 1950s and 60s contained people who had operational experience with the techniques, methods, and institutional culture of the surveillance state they had previously served. That experience didn't evaporate when the uniform changed. The question of what influence it had on the institutional development of the new democratic state's security apparatus, whether the presence of former Gestapo and SD professionals shaped the operational culture of the BND and other services in ways that left documentary traces, is one that the archival openings of recent decades have begun to make partially answerable, without yet producing a comprehensive account. The archive is still being opened. The story of what these men carried with them into the new Germany and what they built there is not finished. Chapter 17. The Ghost of AMT. What the Gestapo left behind. 1958, East Berlin. In the training facility of the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the Ministry for State Security, universally known as the Stasi, a document is being studied. The document is an internal training text, and a specific passage instructs trainees on reference sources relevant to the development of a centralized registration system for tracking categories of state enemies. Among the reference sources cited, in neutral administrative language, is the operational card file system of the Geheime Staatspolizei. The Stasi, the secret police of the German Democratic Republic, the East German state that presented itself as the anti-fascist alternative to the Nazi past, was, in this 1958 training document, citing the Gestapo as a positive methodological reference for how to build a surveillance filing system. The student had become the teacher. The institution that had been declared a criminal organization 12 years earlier at Nuremberg was being cited in a training manual. The card index had crossed the ideological border and changed its uniform and was being taught to a new generation of officers in a new state that claimed to be the Gestapo's antithesis. The Stasi's structural parallels with the Gestapo are not accidental and are not merely analogical. They are documented organizational borrowings. The MFS, at its operational peak in 1989, employed approximately 91,000 full-time staff and maintained a network of an estimated 174,000 registered informal collaborators, the inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, or IMS, a category structurally identical to the Gestapo's Vertrauensmänner. In a country of 16 million people, the card index system contained files on an estimated 6 million individuals, approximately 37% of the entire East German population. The architectural design of the Stasi's primary remand prison at Hohenschönhausen in Berlin reproduced, in its specific physical arrangement, single occupancy cells with externally controlled lighting, interrogation rooms on a separate floor, the transit of prisoners through administrative sections of the building, the operational model of the Prinz Albrechtstrasse Hausgefängnis. Former prisoners of both facilities, in post-war and post-reunification testimonies, have noted the architectural similarities with a recognition that needs no elaboration. The design of institutional fear was transmitted across 4 decades in an ideological divide and rebuilt in new concrete in a city that had been rubble when the original model was operating. The unresolved case of Heinrich Müller sits at the end of the operational history like an open wound in the documentary record. The 2013 DNA analysis of the Berlin remains established what the remains were not. It did not establish what happened to Müller after the 28th of April, 1945. The CIA's declassified file on Müller, available through the National Archives following the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, contains multiple assessments from the 1940s through the 1960s, speculating about his post-war fate, including suggestions of Soviet recruitment and South American escape. None of these assessments contains confirmed evidence. The so-called Müller journals, published in the 1990s and claiming to document CIA interrogations of Müller in 1948 and later, were subjected to forensic document analysis by historian Timothy Naftali and others, who found significant indicators of fabrication. The scholarly consensus is that they are forgeries. The genuine fate of the man who signed the Kristallnacht teletype, who administered the deportation logistics for the final solution, who oversaw the largest arrest operation in German history following the July plot, remains, as of the most current archival research, unknown. He is the lacuna at the center of the archive. The most senior surviving operational chief of the apparatus is simply missing from the record, and the record has not been found that would close the case. The surviving Gestapo case files, spread across archives in several countries, continue to yield new information. The Düsseldorf cards, the Würzburg files, the Bergen records, these have been partially digitized and are accessible to researchers and to the families of victims. But the archive is not static. In 2019, researchers working with Polish archival institutions identified a collection of Gestapo files in a Warsaw archive that had been captured by Soviet forces in 1945 and held in Polish custody, entirely separate from the German holdings, without cross-referencing between the two collections having been conducted. These files, which date from the operational period and cover regions and cases not represented in the surviving German material, were new evidence from 1933 to 1945, found more than 7 decades after the events they document. The archive of the Gestapo is still being assembled. New drawers are still being opened. The full extent of what the system contained across its 12 years of operation has not yet been fully established. There is something I want to say directly about the Yad Vashem central database of Shoah victims' names, because it connects the administrative machinery we've been examining across 17 chapters to the human reality that the machinery processed. As of the most recent figures available to me in the scholarship, the database contains records for approximately 4,800,000 individual victims, out of an estimated 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust. The Gestapo's administrative contribution to the identification, documentation, deportation, and murder of these individuals is present in the surviving case files, the deportation orders, the Reichsbahn transport invoices, the camp intake records. The files that were preserved, by chance, by misfiling, by the inconsistency of destruction efforts in a collapsing regime, have been used by Yad Vashem researchers and by national memorial institutions to identify and name victims who would otherwise remain in the statistical abstraction of the 6 million. Roughly 1,200,000 victims remain without individual documentation in the database. For some of them, Gestapo files that were destroyed in the final months of the war may have been the only administrative record of their existence as individuals in the machinery's categories. The destruction of the files was also the destruction of names. The Stasi's archive, unlike the Gestapo's, survived largely intact. When the Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989 and the GDR began its final dissolution, citizens stormed several Stasi offices and prevented the document shredding that the organization had begun. The result is an archive of approximately 111 kilometers of files. The physical extent of the shelving required to hold the MFS's documentation is measured in linear distance because no other unit of measurement is adequate. The Federal Commissioner for the Stasi Records, established after German reunification, has spent more than 3 decades managing access to this archive for researchers, journalists, and individuals seeking their own files. More than 3 million people have applied to see what the Stasi recorded about them. The institutional memory of the surveillance state survived, in the East German case, because citizens physically intervened to prevent its destruction. The contrast with what happened to the Gestapo's records in 1944 and 45, the burned files, the packed boxes, the Cologne office typing on blank paper as the roof let in the sky, is the difference between an archive and an absence. What the Gestapo left behind is not a single containable legacy. It left the legal precedent of Nuremberg, imperfect and incomplete. It left the personnel network of former officers who carried their operational knowledge and institutional habits into the new Germany and into the Cold War intelligence structures. It left the Stasi's card index, which was a direct methodological descendant. It left the Würzburg and Düsseldorf files, which had been teaching historians about the relationship between surveillance states and the societies that generate them for more than 4 decades of scholarship. It left the grooves in the plaster of Cell 17, which no administrative record contains, but which the earth preserved. And it left an unresolved question about Heinrich Müller, which is also, in a way, a question about the nature of institutional accountability. The most operationally significant individual in the organization's history is simply not in the record, and the record has not been found that would explain the gap. I want to end this documentary where I think it honestly has to end, not with a resolution because the history doesn't offer one. The card index has become the database. The Vertrauensmann has become the digital informant. The Schutzhaft order has become the extrajudicial detention framework. The verschärfte Vernehmung has become the enhanced interrogation technique, translated almost word for word into the legal memos of a different country in a different century. None of these are direct institutional descendants of the Gestapo in any organizational sense. They are independent developments, shaped by their own political contexts and their own institutional histories. But they operate on the same underlying logic that Heydrich articulated in 1936, that the goal of a security apparatus is not to respond to opposition, but to prevent its formation, to build in populations the felt awareness of being observed until the observation becomes self-enforcing. That logic doesn't require a specific institution to carry it forward. It only requires the conditions that make it available: an absence of independent oversight, a population willing to inform on itself, a bureaucracy willing to process the results, and a leadership willing to sign the orders. These conditions are not unique to any time or place. They are, the archive tells us, available whenever the institutional brakes are removed and the people inside the system choose to keep coming to work. The filing room is quiet now. The drawers have been empty for 80 years in the buildings where they operated, and the buildings themselves are mostly gone, bombed, demolished, converted, memorialized, built over. The files that survived are in archives, in acid-free boxes, in climate-controlled storage, accessible to researchers who request them through proper channels and wait for them to be retrieved by archivists who carry them carefully to reading rooms where they are handled with cotton gloves. The names on the cards are the names of people who were alive when the cards were made. Some of them survived. Most of those in the deportation files did not. The cards outlasted many of them. Paper is durable. The tidy pre-printed fields, the dated stamps, the neat cross-reference numbers, all of this persists while the lives it cataloged are gone. The archive is what remains when the institution has ended, and the people it processed have died, and the buildings it occupied have been cleared. The 20th of January, 1942. A conference room on the shores of a lake. 90 minutes. Cognac afterward. The minutes typed in 30 copies, 29 of them burned, the 30th misfiled in the wrong cabinet. Found in 1947. Introduced at Nuremberg. Translated into dozens of languages. Studied in schools, argued over by historians, still available, in full, in the documentary archives that any person with an internet connection can access today. Copy number 16 of 30, the one that survived, the one that ended up in the wrong drawer, the one that tells us what was decided in that room in 90 minutes in 1942. The archive keeps it. The archive keeps everything it was given the chance to keep. That is the archive's function. That is, ultimately, why it matters. Not because it provides resolution, but because it refuses forgetting.